Here's a question: capitalism or socialism? That's what Hao Jingfang's Vagabonds is asking its readers. Or is it? Is there actually a lot more going on in this book? Here to help me explore just about every question the book asks, and there is absolutely a multitude, is Ken Liu. He's the guest for this episode. And if you haven't heard of him, he is pretty much the premier translator of Chinese sci-fi, at least from Chinese into English. And that's not actually even his main line of work. He's also a novelist, and we'll be hearing lots about that from him, as well as even more about his translation and his work on Vagabonds and other works of Chinese sci-fi. I won't even try and list all the things we're going to talk about. We had a very long and very fruitful and just excellent chat. It's a very, very fun episode to record this time around. So, before we get to all that, it's time for the Terrific News, a little news segment where we go through maybe not necessarily what's new in translated Chinese fiction, because I wouldn't claim to know everything, but things that have caught my eye. Let's start with the first thing, which is actually about the book Vagabonds. Now, Ken's English translation of Vagabonds is going to be coming out on the 14th of April this year. That's through Simon & Schuster in the US and Head of Zeus in the Commonwealth. It's the English translation. Ken Liu also provided for me the Chinese publication dates, obviously the original Chinese language version. This is something that came up in our interview, but which he couldn't immediately recall to mind, and I did not know. I should have checked before the show as research, but as you'll hear me mention in the show, I'm sometimes a little bit lazy with research, especially when I know I've got a guest coming on. The info for the publication of The Wandering Earth in the original Chinese edition is thus. It was published in 2 separate volumes, the first in 2011, the second in 2012, and a combined single volume edition came out a whole 4 years later. And Ken's actually confirmed with Hao Jingfang that she finished the manuscript for this book, the unpublished version, in 2009, back when she was only 25. I just turned 27. It was the day before I interviewed Ken, and 2 days ago, so as you can probably work out, I'm recording this a day after my interview. So yeah, I just turned 27 basically, and god damn it, I'm certainly not a Hao Jingfang. So clearly she is a smart, sharp and motivated person, and you're going to hear even more about why that's the case in my interview. Ken told me some amazing things about Hao Jingfang and the awesome stuff she does. So that's our first Terrific News entry. I'm just bringing up the second one now. Yes, now this is about Second Sister, a new book that is coming out. I'm also going to share some release info. Now this is a new book by the Hong Kong writer Chan Ho Kei. This came out, as far as I can tell, published by Grove Atlantic in the US and Head of Zeus in the UK, and I guess perhaps the Commonwealth, I'm not entirely sure. I know that Head of Zeus had taken on a previous one of Chan Ho Kei's books, The Borrowed. Oh yeah, I guess Grove Atlantic published The Borrowed, because I'm on their website and I can see that they're referencing it and quotes to it. But yeah, I've got a review copy of the Head of Zeus edition, which I'm reading in preparation for a reviewers meeting, conference, workshop later in the month. Editor's note: so since I recorded this intro, some news has arisen. This review conference or meeting or whatever that I mentioned has been cancelled because of coronavirus, and so has the London Book Fair, which I was also going to be attending. I think I might have mentioned these two things in past episodes, possibly. But yeah, just a thing that kind of marks where the show has been released in the march of history. Coronavirus has disrupted translated Chinese fiction, or at least the people involved in it, and indeed, of course, in the case of the London Book Fair, it's disrupted publishing, world and UK publishing significantly. So just an interesting wee note. Now let's get back to the Terrific News. And yeah, it's a really good book. I've really been enjoying reading it. What else can I say? It's fast-paced, it's exciting, and it's basically about cyberbullying. and the internet and hacking, and it's just fantastic. And I've not really read... Have I read any other Hong Kong stories apart from this? Perhaps, but nothing in translation, I don't think. So it's an interesting, similar but not the same kind of context of story for me to be reading. So yeah, that is on the way. And the translator of that book, I should mention, is Jeremy Tiang, who I've mentioned many, many times on the show. Clearly because he's a good and interesting translator. So that is our second piece of terrific news. And the third, this one I don't have any particularly substantive information or dates to share, but this is an interesting thing, and it does come up in my interview with Ken Leo, so I thought I would just lay it out now. I may have mentioned this in my previous episode on Liu Cixin's Devourer with my guest Adam McMurtry, because he's a fan of this thing, and this thing it's a thing called My Three Body, and it is let's just say a YouTube adaptation of the Three Body Problem, but the twist here is that it was made in Minecraft. It is a Minecraft version of Liu Cixin's Three Body Problem trilogy of books, and given the kind of failures and hurdles of Three Body to come out, like for the official film adaptation to come out, or for a TV series to come out, or even an animated series, that is still in the works, and yet fans have made a Minecraft version. As far as I'm aware, it's in Chinese with English subs. As you can tell, I haven't watched it yet. That is on my to-do list, and I will watch at least one episode. But yeah, I don't have any particular links, but all you have to do, just type in Three Body Minecraft or My Three Body Minecraft into Google or your internet search or YouTube, and you'll get it. It's all up there for free. And if you watch it and you want to tell me what it's like, you can use the social media links I provide at the end of the show. Get in touch. I'd love to hear about what you think of My Three Body, although I phrased that a strange way, didn't I? That's all the terrific news. Let's charge on and hear the fantastic chat I had with Ken Leo. An absolutely amazing guest. Let's get to that. So I'm on the show with Ken Leo. He's the undisputed Buddha of translated Chinese sci-fi. You've probably heard of him if you've been listening. Ken, can you tell us a wee bit about yourself and what you do before I start questioning you?
Sure. Thank you, Angus, for having me on the show. And it's a real pleasure to be on the show talking about Hao Jingfang's new novel with everyone. So briefly about me, I am an author, and I'm probably most well known for two things. One is my epic cyberpunk epic fantasy novel series called The Liúlàng Dynasty that starts with The Grace of Kings. And the other is a short story I wrote called The Paper Menagerie, which is the lead story in my short story collection, The Paper Menagerie and Other Stories. That particular story won a bunch of awards and is widely anthologized and reprinted. And so chances are most people know me from that line of work, which is my main job. I also do translations not as a profession, but as a way to help out some friends that I've gotten to know over the years. It started basically because I got to know a lot of writers from China, and I really admired their work. And at the time that I first got to know their work, there were very few English translations of their stories available. And I knew nothing about translation, but I thought I wanted to help out, my friends as much as possible. So I got into it to help them first edit their translations, and then later on just doing them myself. And then over the years, I've gotten to do a few more of these for different friends. And I have two anthologies out, Invisible Planets and Broken Stars, which collect some of the stories I've translated. And of course, I also translated The Three Body Problem by Liu Cixin, one of China's most famous sci-fi novels. But the translation part is not my job, and it's really something I do just as a favor for different friends. And so I think, unlike some translators I've talked to, I don't focus as much on the pure textual aspect of translation. I'm much more interested in authorial intent and trying to help the author tell the story in a different language. So That's pretty much, I think, the background that listeners need to know about me.
That's awesome. If anyone's tuning in, I say tuning in, if anyone has sought out this episode because you guys are Ken Leo fans and you haven't listened to this show before, we did do a quote unquote sci-fi season, a string of episodes all about Chinese sci-fi, and quite a lot of those stories, I'm sure the vast majority of them were translated by yourself, Ken, and we had Liu Cixin in there, and we had Hao Jingfang's, maybe the work she's most famous for, Folding Beijing in there. So that's something for the listeners or new listeners to go seek out if you guys enjoy translated Chinese sci-fi by Ken, and indeed, well, translated by Ken, or indeed translated by anyone and written by anyone. We definitely covered a few stories, or at least one or two, which were from Broken Stars and Invisible Planets, which, if you guys haven't read them, are really great collections. Fantastic. Before I just go on and on about how great the stories are, there's a thing we do every episode, or at least if I remember, because I've slipped up and forgotten it a few times. We do like a word of the day where I try and think of a Mandarin word that applies strongly to or captures the essence of the story. But I think for Hao Jingfang's Vagabonds, there's an awful lot of keywords that you could latch onto that could capture the essence of the story, because it's quite a multi-layered story. So instead, I'll go to a real expert. Ken, could you give us a word of the day this time?
I'm actually going to give you a word of the day that is the same in English as it is in Chinese, and it's an invented word by Hao Jingfang herself. It's Ma Earth, which is a combination of Mars and Earth. It is the name of the spaceship that shuttles between the two planets. And I think it actually represents in so many ways, just by its nature, the key themes of this particular novel.
When I was reading, so I read the English, your translation, Ken, I didn't read the Chinese. So on the page, I guess it was Maearth. I was
That's
reading
right.
Marth. Maybe I should have been reading it Ma Earth. In the Chinese edition, which characters spell Ma Earth?
They use Ma or Si, and it literally is a transliteration of English.
Right, so it's a transliteration of Mars, but it also sounds a bit like Earth. Is that the idea?
That is the idea. It's a combination of the two. And it's not based on Chinese names for the planets, but rather in English. Yeah,
the Chinese names of the planets might pop up later in our episode. So later on, I'm going to be asking Ken about Hao Jingfang and her work and Vagabonds, the story itself, and about Chinese sci-fi and translation, and some further reading, kind of stories related to this one way or the other. But right now, we're going to start with publishing-related questions, because it's always good to like eat your greens before your ice cream. And also, I've got a master's in publishing, and this stuff is not necessarily a green for me, even if it is for you listeners. Because selfishness is a great motivator for me.
So, I love this approach.
Works for me. So first question, Ken, there's a bit of a pattern within English language publication of Chinese sci-fi. I think you'd agree with me. Most of the books are translated by yourself. Then they're published in, I think it's North America, not just the US. I could be wrong. By Tor, and then the rest of the world by Head of Zeus. This is at least for the English translations. Head of Zeus being a UK company based in London. But there are some exceptions to the pattern. There's Joel Martinson's Liu Cixin translations, which are Tor/Head of Zeus, but obviously have a different translator. The Wandering Earth also applies to an extent because it's got the same publishers, but the different short stories within are by different translators, yourself included. And then there's some others like The Reincarnated Giant, which is, I forget if that's Columbia University Press or Chinese University Press. They're both CUP and I get them mixed up. And there's Pathological, which is by Wang Jingkan, translated by Jeremy Tiang, and that's an Amazon Crossing book. So how does Vagabonds fit in here? How much does it follow that pattern? How much is it different from a publishing perspective?
So since we are talking solely about publishing, I'm going to start out by saying that I'm not a publisher, and my knowledge of the publishing industry is solely from the author side of it. So it's necessarily very limited and skewed and biased and all of that. So take everything I say with huge grains of salt and so on and so forth.
I always try to remind listeners I'm also not an expert, just an interested person.
Yeah, exactly. We're all sort of able to see just a very narrow slice of the whole picture. So from my perspective, the pattern you've identified is factually true, but it's also somewhat misleading in the sense that I have much less influence and my role is much smaller than people might think, based on the fact that my name appears on the books under the authors. Yes, my name is on there, but I'm hardly the main player in many of these things. When it comes to things like short fiction, like Invisible Planets or Broken Stars, it's true. Most of those projects were initiated by me because I was interested in trying to find markets and get the work of my friends outside of China and give them a global audience, because translation into English is very critical, not just for the North America and the UK market or, the rest of the Anglophone world. Rather, translation into English is the gateway to the rest of the world, period. Editors in Germany, Spain, Japan, Korea, etc. may not be able to read Chinese books, but almost all of them can read English books, because of the way today's world is organized. English is the language that all educated individuals are expected to be able to read.
Right.
So once you have an English translation of a Chinese book, now you have the potential to make Russian deals and Japanese deals and Turkish deals and so on and so forth. Whereas if your book, isn't translated to English first, then you don't really have the opportunity to do any of that. So this is not a claim for the awesomeness of English or anything like that. It just is a fact of the publishing industry, for good or ill. That's the world we live in. Now, as far as the big novels like Liu Cixin's novels are concerned, Zhou and I are colleagues, and we basically play the same role. We were not the ones to arrange these translation deals. CPEC, CEPIEC, which is the acronym for a completely unpronounceable long name for a state publisher in China. That should
have got that on paper as preparation for the show.
Yeah, I can actually tell you what it is. I'm hoping I'll get this right, but I never can. So let me try to do it from memory. It's China Education Import Export, CEPIE, Import Export Company. Yes, exactly. So anyway, it's a state publisher. Well done us. So if you're listening out there, Kelly, this is just not me not being able to remember. So the company, and in fact, two of the executives there were the ones who were particularly relevant for this story. They were the ones who first identified the possibility of bringing the books to the English market, and then they were the ones who approached me and Joel and got us to do the translation, and then of course Tor Books with Liz Gorinsky as the editor and Lindsay Hall now taking over for her. They were the ones who really helped edit the books and provided incredible advice along the way and figure out the marketing plan and so on and so forth, and got the books out. So, the role I play for something like that is very small. I did the translation, and my work was entirely focused on just creating the publishing aspect of it, how to make it work, how to position in the market, how to actually publicize it so that people would know about it and folks who are interested in it would find out about it. That's not something that I was able to help a lot with. And I really do believe that all books have an audience and need to actually find that audience. And that's the hardest part of publishing. And it's almost magic. A lot of times a book that will just not work for a reader will be the perfect book for a different reader. But how do you connect that reader with the book? That's the hardest part, right? And what I find to be amazing is Liu Cixin's books, and now Chen Qiufan's book, and hopefully Hao Jingfang's book will be able to find the right readers. And based on early buzz, it feels like they are going to find the right readers, and that makes me so happy because it's just so difficult and so rare and so magical. When you manage to connect the right book with the readers who are perfect for it. And it really is wonderful for that to happen. And then I think Simon Schuster, which is the publisher for Vagabonds this time, they're also actually my publisher, and the editor is my editor for my own books. So the fact that Vagabonds is being brought out and the publicity manager is in fact the same person who also works on my books. Hi, LJ. So cool. It's wonderful to sort of see this book being positioned and being shown and exposed and talked about by folks who I think are able to appreciate what it is and what it does.
Mm-hmm. And am I right in thinking that? Oh, sorry, a sparrowhawk just flew past my window. I wonder what's
hey,
up.
Nice.
Yeah,
good omen, I think.
I'm going to tell myself it is. Am I right in thinking that outside of North America, Vagabonds is a Head of Zeus book? Are they still involved?
That's right.
Well?
That's right. Head of Zeus also has done amazing work. I haven't mentioned them as much simply because I work much more closely with the U.S. publishers, but I really should do a better job of reminding folks that outside of North America, Head of Zeus, which has done just incredible work in bringing out all these translated novels as well as the collections to the Commonwealth territories, and they do a great job of putting out special editions, signed editions, and my favorite part of touring as an author is when I was in the UK, because Head of Zeus just does such an amazing job of arranging great events. And my publicist was just an awesome individual and gave me so much help. And so when I'm touring, either to promote the translations or my own books, I love visiting the UK, just a cool place to be.
That's cool. As a Scottish person, I want to ask, what's the furthest north that they sent you?
Oh, I'm sorry. I never got into Scotland. So
right.
I think in London for only a few days. So almost everything was in London. But
okay.
I'm planning on doing a personal trip to the UK, and I'm hoping to actually hit Scotland this time. So that's the plan.
If you're coming in summer, you could try and catch the Edinburgh Fringe or the Edinburgh Literature Festival. Is it summertime or is it another time?
It's probably going to be fall. I was actually invited to the festival, but it just conflicted with other things. So I missed my chance last time to go visit. Yeah,
I'll share a really quick anecdote here. So last year when I was doing my master's in Edinburgh, after the previous year I'd been in China, far away from a lot of these English language offer tours. Markus Zusak, who wrote one of my favorite books ever, I Am the Messenger, he was on his world tour promoting Bridge of Clay, and he'd come to the UK, and just like it is with a lot of bands, wasn't coming any further north than Manchester, but Manchester's where I used to live, so I thought, what the hell, I'll go back and I'll catch him. And it so turned out he was asking everyone where they'd come from, because he does a thing, the person who's travelled furthest, he takes their address and then he mails them stuff. So I told him he'd come from Scotland, because this was the furthest north he was coming, and then later the year, I think his publishers made him do maybe even 2 more world tours, because he was back in the UK twice and was in Scotland both times. So I realised that, maybe not meaning to attribute too much power to myself, but it's always helpful to ask the authors to come closer to you.
I like that. I like that.
Not related to Chinese sci-fi at all, but I think it's a good anecdote. And if you ever see Markus Zusak at an event, just tell him you've come from really far away, and you might be the winner of whatever prize.
Make it happen.
Yeah. Okay, second publishing question. This one's about the covers, the aesthetics, because I've seen a couple different covers and also titles. I think I've seen the titles Stray Skies, Vagabond, singular, and Vagabonds, plural, that being the one that I guess was settled on. So you've already kind of stressed that you are not the absolute overseer of all things, you're just one person. But did you have any input regarding the title or the cover?
So Simon Schuster does a great job, as does Tor, of involving the authors and in this case, me as translator in designing the books and covers and so on. So when Simon Schuster does my own books, like The Paper Menagerie or The Grace of Kings or my new collection, The Hidden Girl and Other Stories, I do have a lot of input into the cover. This case is a little different. I felt that in this case, I really wanted to sort of pull back a little bit and allow the publisher and the author to really figure out how they wanted to position the book, because my personal feeling was that the book was complicated to position, and I had some thoughts which I share with the author and with the publisher. But other than that, I said I wanted to step back and not actually be very involved in the design and cover for this book, because it's not Vagabonds is not as easy to classify the way something like the Three-Body Problem is. The Three-Body Problem is very clearly a hard sci-fi book. Vagabonds is very different, and I'm doubtful that some folks who are very I'm not one of them. I don't actually care about genre boundaries at all. But that's because I'm an author. I'm not a publisher, so I don't have to worry about positioning the book in the right niche for the market. But I know that there are folks who are super sensitive about genre boundaries and may even question whether Vagabonds counts as sci-fi or not. So right. I wanted to step back, and then I'm really pleased with the solution they came up with, which I understand Jingfang really enjoyed and liked as well. The cover they ended up doing, which I think suggests a much more literary, quote unquote, approach to the book.
Yeah.
And as far as the titles go, Stray Skies was the original, quote unquote, English title. Often books in China have an English title. And I did not like that title because I felt that it wasn't very clear in terms of what it was trying to say. And I took the original Chinese title and sort of riffed on it, which is something like Wanderer in the Sky, something like that. And I said, you know what? I think the idea here is vagabond. It's really about everything about the word, the romance it evokes, and the harshness of the reality of the vagabond life. All of it brought up the right association for me. And my original suggestion was to use the singular because I wanted to focus on Luo Ying, the main character. But later on, during the production process, my editor pointed out that it actually, Luo Ying is not the only person who deals with the condition of being a vagabond, of feeling torn between homelands. And I agreed with him. And so after discussion with the author, we went with the plural. I'm still not totally used to it because in my mind, during most of the production of the book, I was going with the singular. But now that it's settled on as the plural, sometimes I'm still not used to it. But I do think it's the right choice.
Yeah. Without spilling any beans about the publisher I've been helping out, they of course have the same thing. They have a first working title, and then the title that they actually publish, but the file structure of all the things on the hard drive that we're all moving around doesn't really do to be changing file names too much. So you'll be getting a book ready for publication with the full polished name, but in your instant messaging chat, you're still using an acronym, be it AB or DF or whatever, which is an acronym of the original working title, but looks nothing like the one that's come out. So I can understand if your brain still hasn't quite added the S onto Vagabonds.
Oh yeah, I know well of what you speak. I mean, all my files on my hard drive are singular, so it's often I have to always force myself to remember that's no longer the name. Yeah, I know what you mean.
Okay, last publishing question. So bringing a Chinese sci-fi novel into English is a risk for a publishing house, as we've talked about, because there's lots of ways it could go wrong, seems a bit dramatic. There's lots of ways it could go unnoticed or underappreciated, and that means all the time and money that's been put in might not get a return, as well as, it's a shame just on a literary level that the book doesn't get, or could potentially not get, the appreciation it deserves. I think you've talked a wee bit about that already. So after the success of Liu Cixin and Three-Body Problem, we've seen Tor and Head of Zeus take on risks of going beyond just the works of Liu Cixin and short story collections like Invisible Planets. And they published Bao Shu's The Redemption of Time and Chen Qiufan's Waste Tide. But that's just 2 books. It doesn't guarantee that there is I think you've been skeptical about the idea of there being a new wave or a trend of translated Chinese sci-fi. If I'm recalling correctly, you prefer to treat every book and every author as an individual instance, an individual phenomenon, an individual success. So with all that in mind, why do you think Simon & Schuster and head of Zeus this time took the risks to publish Vagabonds by Hao Jingfang?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm deeply skeptical about the idea that there's anything like Chinese sci-fi or some sort of a sudden wave of interest in all quote unquote Chinese sci-fi, whatever that means. Every speculative fiction book coming out of China that I've read seems so different from every other book. I mean, yes, you can put them into buckets and say, well, these are very similar, and the same way you can do with books coming out of Germany or France or the US. And I'm sure you can run your big data analysis and say this book has a 90% chance of replicating the success of some other book, and so on and so forth. Although, I say that, I'm not entirely sure that the publishing industry actually is quite that advanced. But the bottom line is, I don't think any of that actually works in real life. I think the way books succeed or fail is very idiosyncratic and very contingent on circumstances. Bao Shu is an amazing author, but the book that were published by him is essentially a paraquel or a kind of fanfic set in the three-body universe. So
right.
I feel like there's not a whole lot of risk there. Zheng Jiufan is widely lauded and has a worldwide profile. He's often a guest at literary festivals everywhere. So publishing his novel, to me, also doesn't feel like a huge risk either. I could be wrong. I'm not claiming that these are easy decisions, but it just doesn't seem to me like these are huge risks. In the case of Vagabonds, I think Hao Jingfang may not be as well known yet as Liu Cixin and Bao Shu and Zheng Jiufan perhaps, but she is somebody who's amazing, and we'll talk more about her, I'm sure. So I can go into a little more depth there. But she is, a genuine celebrity in a way I think some readers who only know her as an author don't realize. This is someone who is an entrepreneur who gets invited to do world conferences in Switzerland and Dubai all the time to talk about education and her nonprofit enterprise. So in some ways, her identity as an author is secondary. It's sort of like sometimes people who listen to this podcast may know me as the translator, and they think that, that's the main thing I do, in the way that people, Hao Jingfang is mainly an author. But, in the same way that for her, writing is very secondary to her main work. Translation is very secondary to my main work. She has a worldwide presence and platform. And I think taking her book out, given all the work she's done in other realms and the kind of message she has, is also very sensible. This is not a book, in my view, that's typical, whatever that means, sci-fi, in quotes. It has a lot of potential to reach crossover audiences, because it really isn't very much about concerned with the kind of futurism or future prediction or future imagined possible futures kind of sci-fi that we often think about as within core sci-fi. This is not like that. This is not within core sci-fi. It's a very different book. It's much more philosophical and much more about asking foundational questions about what it means to be free, what it means to be equal, what it means to receive according to your merit, and what it means to have a political system that actually is responsive to the needs of the people. It asks all sorts of complicated, difficult questions, not just for readers in China, but actually for readers around the world. I mean, I think that's what makes it transcendent. It's not a book that's meant for a specific moment or a specific audience. It's meant for a much broader audience. And the most amazing thing is she wrote this book many years ago when she was a much younger and less mature author.
Right.
So, it's incredible to me to imagine what her next book will be like, which she's working on. So anyway, super exciting to me to see this book out.
If you can pardon my ignorance, because I should have checked this. When was this book published in the original Chinese? Do you know which year?
Oh, it's got to be at least a decade plus, now. I can't remember exactly when, but it was a long time ago.
Gosh, right.
This is not a recent book.
I'm not going to ask you to do this, but if anyone was reading it and trying to put it in the context of the times it was written, at least from Hao Jingfang's perspective, and I guess that would be the important one to take, they would have to remember it's looking at timeless themes, but if you're really fixated on putting it in the time it was written, you'd have to remember that's not now. It's, like you said, 10 plus years ago.
Let me just do a quick check to see if I can get you the answer on this.
Okay.
This was published. I mean, I don't remember when it's published, but it's written certainly a long time ago. And
yes, the other thing.
I can't find the exact date of when the original book was published, because it was also published in multiple editions. I think the first edition, when it came out, was actually divided into 2 separate books. And then it was combined together. I can't remember the exact publishing history, but it was a long time ago.
Okay, well, that's something listeners who are interested can find out. And if you guys want to reach the show and educate me, please do. And if you guys don't know how, I'll be giving out like the show's social media at the end of the episode and possibly also at the start. When you were talking about Hao Jingfang's other roles, that reminded me when I've done kind of somewhat lazy research for the show, I just type in authors' names into YouTube, especially if I know that they can speak English, and Hao Jingfang can speak English. And this applies to Chen Qiufan too, if I remember correctly. If you pop their names just in pinyin, so as they would appear in English, into YouTube, you get videos of them doing talks. And I think there are quite a few videos of Hao Jingfang talking about her work. I'm sure there are some of Chen Qiufan as well. But I know in each case, there are also videos of them talking about business, economic, society, I guess the future, but not from a sci-fi angle, more like a where is the economy, where is this or that going. So yeah, just to there is actual evidence you guys can find on YouTube that backs up what Ken's saying about Hao Jingfang and Chen Qiufan not just being authors, but having other roles, other jobs.
Yeah, they have all these entire separate lives. Chen Qiufan is this amazing tech entrepreneur, and just I think most of it just never comes across in the publicity for the books, which I don't really understand why, because it seems like people will be interested in that. But yeah, they have entirely different lives, doing stuff, amazing stuff.
Yeah, it's a bit mind-boggling. Maybe it's only mind-boggling because they're not packaged as that way and not presented. So you find out later that they're these amazing entrepreneurs and people out there with existing outside the page. But anyway, before I just start repeating myself, let's charge on and talk about the author herself, I guess.
Yeah.
Hao Jingfang.
So Hao Jingfang is this absolutely amazing individual, and I'm really honored to call her my friend. She graduated with a degree in physics and then went on to become a PhD in economics. And her day job is as the deputy director for a quasi-governmental think tank in China that focuses on research and development issues. She writes reports or oversees the composition of reports. I mean, she used to write them herself. I don't believe she does that herself anymore. I think she supervises teams. But these are reports given to the State Council in China, and these are sort of policy recommendations and research reports that influence, the highest policymaking organ in the world's second largest economy. But other than that, she is also the founder of something called Tongxing Academy, which is a non-profit social enterprise dedicated to the education of underprivileged and rural children in China. This is just an absolutely amazing thing, because rural and rural education in not just in around the world, in China, in parts of Latin America, in Africa, in all over Asia, that's been a deep passion of mine. And Hao Jingfang, so I would to this aspect of her work. She, as a researcher, as an economic research and analyst, had to do a lot of on-site visits to see what the reality in some of these extremely remote and poor regions of China, what life there is like. I think people don't understand how big and diverse a country China is, and how unequal the development has been. You've got parts of China. I mean, Hao Jingfang herself talks about it. She says that when she goes on these trips and she travels from Beijing to the most remote parts of China, in Yunnan or Guizhou or elsewhere, she feels like she's not just traveling through space, but through time. There are parts of China life appears to have frozen 300 years ago, and people are literally digging for livelihoods out of the dirt. There's no electricity. They are in isolated places with no roads leading to the outside. Or, she goes to other places where the entire villages are depopulated because all the young, able-bodied adults have gone to the cities to look for work, and the people left behind are elderly grandparents along with children who never see their parents except once during the lunar New Year holidays. So there's an entire generation of children growing up without their parents, without creative educational toys, without really all the things you associate with a normal childhood. And Hao Jingfang says, this is intolerable. She has been deeply dedicated to the idea of combating inequality and trying to do good. I think if you read Floating Beijing, you'll see that aspect of her, that very rationalistic, that deeply compassionate and empathetic soul, guided by rational at work. And this is what she's dedicated her work to do. She used the publicity that came with winning the Hugo Award to do something that I think very few authors can claim to have done. She used that publicity to attract funding to form this nonprofit dedicated to the education of rural children. Her goal is, she thinks, right, what children are really lacking in these places isn't just book learning, isn't just rote memorization or test taking skills. She says what they're lacking the most is creative education, creativity. So this will be a theme that will recur in Vagabonds, of course. She's a deep believer that fostering creativity in children is the most important thing we can do for any family, for any nation, for the entirety of the human race. That in order for us as a species to thrive in the future, we must foster creativity and unlock the potential of every human being on this planet in as broad a way and as deep a way as possible. So her foundation hires teachers that sends them to these remote places to teach art, to teach creativity, to teach children how to tell stories, make paintings, bring their own imagination to life. And these are children who haven't even had toys. This is an incredibly difficult task. She's thrown herself into hiring experts to develop curriculums for this. And she's a deep believer in not relying on a charity model, but on a nonprofit social enterprise model, meaning she sells these curriculums to wealthy, privileged, relatively privileged families, middle class and upper middle class families in the big cities of China. And these curriculums are very much loved and welcome because they're beautiful. They're so well done. They teach children how to be creative and to free their own infinite potential. She sells these curriculums in the big cities, and then that allows her to fund the giving of these curriculum and classes and hiring teachers to send to the rural parts. It's an incredible model. She's done this for multiple years. It works, and she's being invited all over the world to World Economic Forum and education conferences to talk about her experience and what she's done. And I feel like to her, this is the most important work she's done. And I agree with her. It is incredible. And the fact that, I get to know her as a friend and to play a small role in helping her get to this point because Floating Beijing managed to give her the publicity to get this kickstarted. I'm incredibly proud of that part of it, that I played a very tiny role in helping her on this. It really is just so wonderful to see her succeed. And then, of course, other than that, I should also mention that beyond those incredibly accomplished jobs and entrepreneurship, she's also running her own sci-fi IP studio to develop science fiction novels and stories into further film for the screen. She's also mother of two, and a wonderful mother. She also, right, I forgot, she also writes novels, right? That's the
Somewhere
other
in
thing
there.
that she does. So
Well,
people are always
thanks for
asking her,
that
how do you
intro,
find the
Ken.
time, and how do you do this? And I really think she probably has some way of slowing down time. There's no way for her to do everything she does otherwise.
Well, that's what I've thought in regard to a few of the people I've encountered in my journey learning about translated Chinese lit and Chinese sci-fi, if there is such a thing. It's incredible how some people do these things. Now I'm just trying to think back and remember the couple of things I wanted to mention. Yes, now one of them was, I know that as you mentioned, a lot of people, or maybe just in the Western world, or it's even just outside of China, don't quite realize how diverse China is, like geographically, culturally, in terms of wealth and wealth disparity. So at least at least geographically, but in other aspects, I try to cover that diversity within one country and even China, the Chinese people extend beyond the boundaries of the country. So whatever the idea of Chinese literature means on the podcast, I try to give a nice, well-rounded picture. So I've found a way to do that beyond just the stories I pick. Another thing I've done is I've made a little map. I've made like a custom Google map and put it on my site, and links to it and whatnot. So every story we do on the podcast, and I'm more addressing the listeners than you can, I chart it on the map. I think for this episode, I'm not entirely sure where I'm going to place on the map. I don't think Google Maps features Mars yet, but I'll figure
Yeah,
something
that's
out.
true. Good point.
Yeah.
I mean, I do appreciate your efforts on that, because it's sometimes incredibly hard for people to grasp this, because we have this model of the nation state, and there's a tendency among all people to sort of treat our home groups as extremely diverse and outsider groups as monolithic.
Right.
But the two countries to which this is most particularly problematic, are India and China.
Right.
There's just both of these countries are just insanely diverse. You cannot even understand how linguistically, culturally, in everything. I mean, in China, it's extremely common for writers to publish stories and then have to footnote their own stories and say, this is a custom in such and such a region. Most of you probably don't know it, but it's true.
And they're doing that for Chinese readers, not for foreign readers.
Yes, exactly. It's so often because, many, it's very, the country is so vast and so different and so diverse that it's incredibly hard to say something is Chinese, whatever that means.
Right.
In the same way, it's incredibly hard to say something is Indian or something is American. That may be a model that most people understand. It's incredibly hard to say what is, quote unquote, an American restaurant, because it's so diverse. What does that mean? So there you go.
It's a thing on Google Maps, bringing up Google Maps again, is that at least here in the UK, every restaurant, Google Maps tells you what kind of restaurant it is. So for Valentine's Day, me and my girlfriend went to one which Google Maps says is a British restaurant. But again,
dear.
what on earth what is British food?
What does that mean?
Well, the dishes that we had were, I guess it's a little bit like, it's probably not even very equivalent to an American restaurant. It's quite a range of stuff. There is, I guess in the core, there's things that you could call British, a lot of meat and potatoes, but then there's all these things taken from around the world, I suppose. But anyway, I guess that was the idea of diversity I grew up with. Like you said, in the Western world, multicultural countries, you hear the word diversity, and it's really referring to the diversity that you have within your own country. So in Britain, I guess it's the post-colonial, the diversity that's arisen out of post-colonialism. And you don't, at least I was never pointed to consider the idea that other parts of the world have their own kinds of diversity. There are other, it takes many forms, not just the form you're familiar with.
Right. And I think part of that it has to do with the fact that the reality of localism, of regionalism, of true diversity is at odds with the myth of nation states. Ever since the Enlightenment, the Westphalian model of nation states has exerted a huge amount of pressure for countries, both the colonized and the colonizers, to hew closer and closer to the imagined vision of some some model of what it means to be French, to be German, to be British, to be Japanese, and to be Chinese. And so when these official efforts at standardizing and creating a pseudo-national culture runs up against the reality that these are not real, that there's an incredible amount of local variation and diversity, people can get sort of shocked. I think even folks in modern nation states often are shocked to discover how diverse their own countries actually are, and that nation states are actually far more complicated. There is no one way to be British, and there's no one way to be American or Chinese, for that matter.
You don't have to, as a Scottish person, you don't need to tell me how I'm considered to be British or not is different for every person I talk to. It's a confusing world.
It's a really confusing world. Yeah, I wish people appreciate how confusing everything is.
Yeah, and I'm sure as I get older, I'm only going to be more confused.
Good thing.
Yeah, true, it is a good thing. So let's veer away from geopolitics back to Hao Jingfang and simple questions. So this is a simple question with a long preface, which I'll try and scoot through quickly. So when I was doing my lazy YouTube research for the Folding Beijing episode, I found what I would call a really wholesome video. And it was the recording of Hao Jingfang collecting or being awarded her Hugo Award. I think it was the short novel or novella award for Folding Beijing. And first she gives a speech in the video, and you're standing on the stage nearby looking very happy for her, and then you give a wee speech after her. And I think you could just see like visual proof on your face that backs up what you wrote in your intros to the Invisible Planets and Broken Stars Chinese sci-fi anthologies, that the authors you translate are your friends and the ones who you think are just the most awesome, rather than like you trying to objectively work out who are the best authors writing science fiction in China or who are the most sellable and marketable. It's really just you emphasize it's your own favorites. And you could see on the stage there that was one of your favorites, one of your friends getting the prize. So the question I've got is a really simple one. I guess we already know why you think Hao Jingfang is awesome. You've gone into that in great detail, but what do you think makes her writing awesome?
So Hao Jingfang writes in a very unique style, in my view. I don't even know how to explain this, but she writes in a style that I think some people would describe as translation-ese. So let me unpack that a little bit. So contemporary Chinese writing is mostly done in what's described as modern standard Chinese, which is a Mandarin variant. And it has a deep history in Baihua Wen, but to be honest, the best way to think about it is it's comparable to a newly emerging vernacular literature, similar to the way that during the Renaissance, vernacular literatures emerged in Europe, Italian, Spanish,
right,
so on and so forth.
Can I interject slightly here? So the ideas of vernacular Chinese popped up in the very first episode I did. It was about Lu Xun and his Diary of a Madman, and the idea of anytime a new culture writer, which is the movement Lu Xun was in, for any new listeners who haven't heard me go on about this stuff before, any of the other new culture writers we covered were also pushing for the advancement of vernacular Chinese in literature. So I just want to check, when you say vernacular, are you talking about the same thing I talked about in those episodes, or are you talking about something even more modern? It's the same one.
It's continuous. Let's put it that way. So I would say that it is continuous. Like, in other words, modern standard written Chinese is obviously a continuation of the Baihua Wen movement that Lu Xun was participating in. It is, of course, evolved away from that, but it is definitely, you can see it is, evolved from the same language. So what I would say is, because serious literature being composed in modern standard written Chinese is a relatively recent phenomenon. Not many generations have accumulated around it. It's stylistically very fluid. So of course, it's deeply influenced by traditional vernacular Chinese novels from the Ming Qing dynasties, and also all the oral storytelling traditions and all the written versions based on that, and so on and so forth. So some writers who are particularly attuned to that strain of the evolution of modern standard written Chinese, writing a style that's closer to perhaps in some ways to the way people speak. Hao Jingfang does not, in my view, write quite like that. Her writing is much more deeply influenced by translations. And this is a very common phenomenon you see in vernacular literatures. So again, in the Renaissance, when you have Italian modern English and modern Spanish works being written, all of these works show a huge amount of classical influences from classical languages. So, one example would be Milton's Paradise Lost, which literally treats English, which is not a language with a lot of strong declensions, as though it were a strongly, heavily inflected language like Greek or Latin. And so some of the sentences in Milton are virtually incomprehensible unless you realize that he was writing English as though it were a strongly inflected language. So, it's sort of translation niche-ish or whatever. Translation niche refers to the idea of Chinese that's heavily influenced by translation models from Western languages, primarily English, but also French and German and quite a bit of Japanese. In fact, some people would argue that the influence through Japanese is even stronger than English. I think that's debatable. Anyway, the point is, when you read Hao Jingfang, the way she writes is not it's not. I don't know quite how to put this. It shows a very strong set of influences from translations from other languages, and it feels in some ways better suited to express her ideas, which are almost always universal and cosmopolitan rather than specifically Chinese, whatever that means.
Right.
She's quite unlike many authors who are deemed as masters of the idea of Chineseness. She's not like that at all. She's much more interested in writing both in terms of her content and her ideas about universal themes, and her writing itself exhibits that kind of quality. So I think the story is unique in that way. Some people like that style, some people don't. Some people find translation needs very grating as Chinese readers. I don't particularly find that way. I have a much more cosmopolitan taste. I enjoy works that are clearly derived and hew to ideas of classical beauty. I think they're very beautiful, but I also enjoy the experimental work that Hao Jingfang does, which incorporates a huge amount of translation needs into her writing. The fact that she calls her ship Mǎèsī is, an example. It's just, she just throws it in there with little concern about how people will feel about it.
Yeah, you literally read my mind there. I was going to say, and this is why you've chosen Mǎèsī as the word of the word of the day. So there we go. So what you were saying about the stories not necessarily being specific to China or imbued with Chineseness, but being universal. So this exact point came up between me and my guest, Lu Guanzhao, on the Folding Beijing episode when we were talking about the whole thing. And on every episode, there's usually a bit where I try and say what's a unique Chinese aspect of this story. And despite the fact Folding Beijing is called Folding Beijing, it's set in Beijing, a future version. There's almost nothing you can, at least I found, that I could latch onto apart from maybe the food that people are eating. And even that's just there to indicate class distinctions. And Guanzhao, my guest, kind of agreed with me. Yeah, it could easily be Folding London. That's where he's staying, organizing the London Chinese sci-fi book club. So yeah, Folding Beijing, Folding London. And then in Vagabonds, I think you can see that even more. It's a story about humanity, not really about any particular culture or country.
Right. Absolutely. Agree with that 100%.
Yeah.
She perhaps more than many other authors explicitly tries to do that. And I think it has to do with the fact that, I think Vagabond shows clearly that her philosophical influences are very Western. And that's what she wanted to do. She wants to write a very universalist book that hews to the tradition of Neoplatonism and the Enlightenment. That's what she was doing.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of kind of taking influence from the West or from another culture, another world, and looking at this story, although we haven't talked about the story, at the fundamental level, it's about being between Earth and Mars, two societies, two systems. Although we will touch more on this later, I'd like to ask you if you know whether Hao Jingfang has herself ever really been between two worlds in any way, since
Well,
Mars and Earth are supposed to stand in for something, some kind of two worlds, whatever that
yeah,
may be.
yeah, you're absolutely right about that. So a couple words. I mean, I do think it's very tempting to read an author's work through their lives.
Biography, yeah.
Yeah, and I want to caution readers against it.
Mm.
Some of it is self-serving because I, as an author, often get subjected to this sort of thing, and it annoys me to no end. There are people who come to me and ask me how my relation with my mother is because I wrote the paper Menagerie, and I'm
Oh
sort of
no.
like, good Lord. And the thing is, Angus, I mean, we all know this because this is the sort of thing you rarely ask, straight white males of a certain age and approach. Like, the idea is some authors are universalist authors who are praised for the imagination, and no one thinks
Right.
that somehow their individual biographies limit what they do. But other authors often get read as though they're doing nothing other than enacting and performing their biography for the audience, for their delectation. And I just don't think it's particularly fair. So having said all that, I will say Hao Jingfang has traveled extensively and in fact lived abroad in her youth. So, make of that what you will. I believe when she's describing the psychology of Luo Ying living on Earth as a young girl, as a teenager, and trying to deal with cultural shock and so on and so forth. I think some of that is drawing on Hao Jingfang's real experiences, in the sense that I draw on my own experiences as an immigrant when I'm writing about a lot of stories of alienation and encountering new cultures. But it's not autobiographical in the sense that I'm literally saying this is what happened to me. And I don't think she's saying this is literally what happened to her, but some of the psychology she could describe vividly because she went through something similar to that. And then you were saying, the whole idea of between two worlds and what are the two worlds. So I do want to get into that a little bit deeply. I think it's super tempting and super reasonable for readers to come to this and say, Mars and Earth are two worlds at war, and they have two entirely different political and economic systems, and they are deeply suspicious of each other. So they must stand in for China and the US, or China and the West, or something like that. And I want to tell readers that that is a perfectly fine reading if you want to go there. But it also means that you're sort of missing the most interesting aspect of the book by reading that way, because if you try to apply that model a little bit deeper, you'll realize that nothing works under that model. Nothing matches.
It's not like a one-for-one reading. It's
right.
It's limiting.
It's sort of like when you're reading Ursula K. Le Guin's, The Left Hand of Darkness or The Dispossessed, or all of those novels, and you read the two sides as the Soviet Union being Anaris and the United States and the Western Bloc is Uras, then you're sort of missing the point entirely, because that means the novel has no relevance once the Cold War is ended. But
and it hasn't transcended the boundaries of what's possible in the world as it was then. It's not imaginative.
That's right. And if you read The Dispossessed today, of course, you realize that the anarchist collectivist utopia of Anaris is nothing like the Soviet Union. In fact, it's
exactly
in some ways the counter Soviet Union. And if you read Vagabonds, you realize that Mars is nothing like China. It's
small.
It's tiny. That's the most important thing. It's in fact, I think the Martian system, as the characters themselves point out, cannot possibly function above the level of a city-state. It only works because Mars is a city-state. It's a state that is perpetually engaging in revolution against itself, and it is a collectivist, engineered utopia, which is deeply dedicated to the idea of democracy and republicanism, but nonetheless supports authoritarian rulers and is dedicated to individual freedom and creativity. These are things that we normally don't think of as fitting into one. We can't imagine how they would just work together, and they do. And Mars clearly does not actually function like China, because if you're talking about a society that's dedicated to the idea of promoting creativity and individual achievement within that realm, then good luck finding that in China. So
right.
Mars is not China, and Earth is also not our Earth. It's a hyper capitalist, hyper intellectual property oriented society, and it can function like sort of a caricature of today's world, I suppose, if you really wanted to push for it. But I think that's also limiting. It's not quite like that. It actually, Earth, in some ways, in the book, shows another philosophical approach to organizing human beings. And I think perhaps the best way to think about what she's trying to do in this book is to just go back to what she herself said. In the book, at one point, the characters say that, these are the words that move people: freedom, merit, equality. And every generation takes one of these as their banner of revolution and pursues it, and only to realize at the very end that in the pursuit of one of these qualities, the others too have been neglected and destroyed. And so their children will rebel against them, and society is in perpetual revolution as a result of that. And I think that's actually a very good way to think about it. That's what this is about.
Yeah, it's gotten rather dark where I'm sitting, so I'm just going to go in. I was using natural light coming in the window I saw the sparrowhawk through. That light's going away, so I'm just going to leave my microphone, turn on the light, come back. So give me a few seconds. Okay, now I can see my questions again. Fantastic. So my next question was going to be, can you summarize and tell us what are the societies on Earth and Mars in the story like? I think we've done that. Have we missed anything, or do you think the listeners have got the right idea?
I think they got the basic idea, but let me just try to summarize a little bit. So Earth is a society in which nation states still exist, but all the nations are hyper-capitalist and hyper-dedicated to the idea of intellectual property being the most important kind of product. And in this world of incredible teeming sea of humanity, for some reason, though, creativity actually has been stifled. Earth appears to be not a place in which a huge amount of innovation is happening for whatever reason.
It's a homogenized place, right?
Somehow, yeah, we're not clear exactly why, but somehow either the system or the interlocking rules about creativity, about intellectual property, somehow has stifled creativity on Earth. And so the people of Earth look to Mars as kind of an incubator and an originator of new ideas. And Mars is a tiny, tiny world of colonies that have broken away from Earth after a war, somewhat similar to the American War of Independence. And the Martian society is tiny. I think the population is no more than 20 million. It's a city-state. It's run along it's administered in a way very similar to the Greek city-states of Platonic time. And it is very, very dedicated to the whole idea of fostering creativity within each individual. The Martians are super proud of the fact that their education system is entirely focused around fostering creativity for each child.
Right.
But at the same time, they don't seem to want the children to understand their own revolutionary past or history. In fact, Mars is not a utopia at all, as people find out. It's a deeply repressive society, despite the huge dedication to freedom. Paradoxically, a society founded on freedom has turned authoritarian and made it impossible to even speak about the past. And so as you go through the novel, you find out the waves of revolution that have convulsed Martian society and why every generation rebels against its injustices, and how it's not a simple choice between Earth and Mars, because both are actually utopias and both dystopias at the same time. And while there is some idea that the two can learn from each other, it's not clear what that means. And the book is heavily philosophical. It quotes extensively from the French existentialists, Greek Neoplatonists, and so on and so forth. And it becomes very hard to wrap your mind around, I think, if you ended up wanting to go deeply into it. It's also not, in my view, a traditional character-driven story in the way a lot of contemporary commercial fiction tends to be. I think the such an obsession with character-driven commercial fiction that we think that's the only aesthetically pleasing way of writing a book. This is not like that. The folks in the book make explicit speeches at each other, and there are extensive quotations from philosophers, and characters talk to each other about philosophy and debate over philosophy and argue over intellectual property laws and write propagandistic plays.
Right.
And so everything's very explicit in some way. And if you are not used to that style of writing, you may find the story deeply alienating. But I encourage readers to look beyond that and get into it, because there is more than one way to tell a beautiful story. And I think the story is very beautiful and thoughtful and deep. But you have to be willing to accept that there are other ways to tell a wonderful story that evokes deep emotions than to follow the modern character-driven quote-unquote approach.
Yeah, it's a reflective and philosophical tale. It's not a page turner, and it's not full of actions and explosions and mass deaths like you might find in Three Body. Like you've emphasized with the sci-fi from China you've translated. Each author, each story is its own thing. Don't look for especially in the case of this book, if you think it's just going to be another Three Body book just because it's sci-fi from China, like you're in for disappointment on that front. I think that's fair to say.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so now that you've laid out Earth and Mars and the two societies, I have to ask you, which one would you rather live on if you were forced to choose one?
This is not as easy a question as one might think. There's no question that Earth is much more familiar to us. If we had to pick one, just because we want to live with the devil we know, Earth is more, tolerable, it seems. Despite all of the problems with late capitalism, we sort of know how to survive in it. Mars is a radically different society. This is a society in which, the idea of your creation and what you produce is directly connected with with the value you create, quote unquote, is directly correlated with your status, and the economic reward that you receive has been broken. It's the kind of collectivist society that only functions at a very small scale, like a kibbutz or something like that. And you have to sort of be prepared for a radically different way of viewing this. But there are aspects of it that are very attractive. And Hao Jingfang makes it super clear. If you're an author, right, when you're working in a very commercial late capitalist society like the one we have, we're not actually dystopian yet, I suppose. But I think every author feels the need to somehow make a living, quote unquote, right? So either you work a day job or you figure out how to make your book sell. The idea that you have to create value to receive reward is so fundamental to the way that we think that we don't question it. We sometimes mistake rent seeking for value creation in our fiat economy for that reason.
Yep.
We think that whatever late capitalism is, the idea that you work for a living, that you exchange labor and intellectual creations, that you have to actually appeal to the market in order to succeed. We think that's perfectly normal. There's nothing wrong with that. We think that's just like the way it ought to be. But on Mars, you don't do that. There's no market. On Mars, the idea is that it doesn't matter what regardless of your how popular your thing is, you're going to receive a basic standard of living. You're going to get your house, you're going to get your food, you're going to get your transportation, you're going to get your medical needs met. You will be fine. It's sort of like universal basic income taken to its logical conclusion. You will be fine even if you do nothing. But you are encouraged to be creative, to make things, not because you can get rich and wealthy from it, because you can't. In fact, on Mars, the people from Earth think that all Martians are being exploited because people could come up with wonderful innovations and they cannot patent it or copyright it or whatever, and they even find the idea repulsive. They just give it away to the Martian people, the delegates from Earth find this intolerably exploitative. But that's not how the Martians see it. You create for the joy of creation and for the fact that you may find your audience. I mean, the Martians do compete. They compete with each other to see who can get more people to like their stuff. But it's
citations,
not
right?
citations, exactly. It's very academic in that way. It's sort of like an academic environment. The citations are awesome, but you can really create and do what you want to do. If you want to do experimental films that no one wants to watch, go for it. As long as you're happy and you're fulfilling your own need to create, which is a deep human fundamental need, that's okay. Like that aspect of Mars is incredibly attractive, especially to people who are creative. There's a lot of beauty to that view of life. But, of course, the reality is, as you find out, the Martian society, that utopian aspect cannot be sustained without some very ugly aspects as well. And that's what Liúlàng has to find out and decide for herself.
Yeah, there's so many things I could say in reply. The two things that are like at the front of the queue of my mind or my tongue. One's that I would definitely want to live in the Martian society. I'm doing this wee niche podcast with something like 250 listeners. Not making an awful lot of money doing freelancing, and although this isn't really a long-term viable future for me, I love it so much. It's amazing.
But you get what I mean, right? As a creator, you get what I mean. Like, it's cool. You don't have to care about the market. Like, you can just do it because you love it.
Yep. And so long as I know that there's people not citing it but enjoying it, it doesn't have to. I don't really have the capitalist mindset of my growth must expand and expand and expand. Okay, it would be nice if it doesn't shrink, but the point is doing something high-minded. But then again, like, that's me. All my pals here in my hometown of Dundee, pretty much all of them do engineering, and I do wonder how keen would they be to live in a society where it's like, okay, the thingamajig you've designed, the valve or whatever, its success will be measured by how much it's cited and used, and there's not much of a career path for you per se. Maybe they would like that, I don't know, but it seems like it's a society of the mind, and if you are not of the mind, if your interests are more, I don't know, dynamic or entrepreneurial, maybe not. So that's the first thing that was at the queue in my brain. And the other things about, like you're saying, the things that you need to sustain this and the fact it can only exist on a small scale. I remember when I was like end of high school, start of uni, I had some very idealistic lefty beliefs, which I still have to an extent. They've come into more contact with reality now. And one book I remember reading and being inspired by was Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell, where, long story short, he volunteers for the Spanish Civil War, where there's a leftist, democratic, communist, socialist, whatever coalition coming up against a conservative, reactionary, fascist rebellion, and the rebellion ends up winning. George Orwell's on the losing side, but he gets, just by an accident, he doesn't end up with the Soviet Union aligned international brigades where most of the volunteers went. He ends up with a anarchist division in the Catalan region, who are, as well as being kind of anarchist in the same way that the Martian society here is. Like, I won't go into that. It's too complicated. But
it's too complicated, but I know what you mean.
Yeah. They're not the Soviet Union. They are more grassroots, let's say. They're less centralized. And
it actually makes a huge difference, though. That sometimes people don't understand that it makes a huge difference. Like, you can have quote unquote communism working at the level of the kibbutz. It's fine. It's just that when you scale it up to the level of the Soviet Union, that you have tragedies. You just that's something that people have a hard time wrapping their minds around. Scale matters.
Well, it's not just scale, though. It's also outside pressure. Like, they had this Catalonian kind of nationalist anarchist movement had a military that George Orwell describes as their society was totally flat level, egalitarian, DIY, do it yourself. Their military had the most effective structure for a military, which is hierarchical, top down, but they made sure that there wasn't the old class differences weren't built into that. So ranking officers were still ranking officers, but they weren't the wealthiest people from society. So it's really amazing to read. But what he doesn't say outright, but which you kind of realize upon reflection, is this thing existed in wartime. They were fighting for their existence, not just against the fascists who were coming for them, but later they were also under attack from basically on the orders of the Soviet Union's international brigades or whatever. There were skirmishes between them. So they had a lot to fight for and strive for, and they were under pressure from all sides. And the same thing applies kind of here. The Martians have something, a big other, and not just an imaginary other, a real threatening one, Earth, to define themselves against. And like it applies here in Scotland as well. In Scotland, the nationalism you find is nice nationalism. It's not scary, it's not xenophobic, it's not directed at the minorities within our country, but kind of the unspoken thing is it's because the other is England, the big baddie. And I do wonder, if you took away England, who would we turn on? Who would the other be?
That's a great question for so many things outside of this novel too. I mean, I'm totally with you. In fact, all of these things are sort of spoken about in the novel, or touched upon in some ways too. I think one of the things that I want to make sure readers get is that this novel is so interesting because she really does get into all the implications of it. I mean, there are just long debates and examinations into how can the Martian society actually work, and what are the problems when you do things this way. I mean, she talks about how when you take away the incentive to create for a living, you create some good results, but also some terrible results. People start seeking status within the organization, within the bureaucracy, and there is quite a bit of rent seeking going on. It's very academic in the sense that folks start realizing that to get higher status, you often have to appeal to your superiors, and that becomes more important than just creating things. And so
right.
you set up society to be a certain way, but it doesn't actually work out that way, because people always find the path of least resistance, and then that often is in fact not what you desire. So it's interesting. And also, there's a huge debate over whether Mars actually is a democracy or not. And I think that section is very important because in many ways, Mars is based on Greek city-states. And then you have the question of, is this actually a democracy or not? There are long debates over, as the consul, whether, the Liúlang's grandfather, who is the supreme leader of Mars, actually is a dictator or not. And those debates are very meaningful, and I do encourage readers to read them and think about it, whether Hans is actually a dictator or not. There are both ways of reading it, and then how you read it, I think, determines in a lot of ways how you think about this book.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So here's something we've touched on a little bit about how the book might not strictly be sci-fi, or if it is sci-fi, it's not your traditional, conventional sci-fi. So I learned, I think it was when I was doing, no, I don't think, I know, when I was doing my dissertation on the publishing of translated Chinese sci-fi, I was looking at which things aren't translated and published in English as well. And I learned that Hao Jingfang doesn't just write sci-fi. She's got some literary fiction, but it does not exist in translation. And the realist stuff, I wonder if it ever will. Probably not anytime soon. So she does this literary fiction as well as speculative fiction, like sci-fi, and this book, whether it is sci-fi or not, is a philosophical question. So yeah, the fact that she has these other styles of books makes sense to me, because this is such a pondering philosophical book, although it does have like the odd flash of hard sci-fi. It's not vice versa. It's not a lot of hard sci-fi with the odd bit of philosophy. And the thing it was kind of reminding me of, and there is an obvious thing that pointed me towards this, because the author, Ursula K. Le Guin, she's got a book, who is, how could I best describe her, not being an expert? She writes fantasy and sci-fi and all sorts of things from a very kind of left field. I'll say left field rather than left wing. She does a lot of ecological, feminist, anthropological, that's a very key word, philosophical fantasy and sci-fi books. So I've read The Dispossessed, and this, obviously it's about Mars and Earth. One's capitalist, one is not, so there's really obvious parallels there. But there's another Ursula K. Le Guin book this reminded me of. It's part of her Earthsea series. I think it's the third or the fourth one, I don't know, but it's called Tehanu.
I think it's the fourth one. Yeah,
Tehanu. Yeah, the fourth one. I've only read those four, because Tehanu, it's a slow book, and there's an interpretation on the Wikipedia article for it, which I read beforehand, which framed me to read it as like almost like an anti-fantasy book. It kind of avoids epic action, lots of plot points, quests, really direct conflict. That's all kind of stripped away or swapped out, or whichever verb you prefer, for a kind of story which is set in a made-up world with magic and all sorts of wonderful things, but those are all backgrounded. The foreground is a slower, social, thoughtful, almost like domestic story, although she cheats a bit at the end and brings in some bangs, which I guess to some extent... I'm not trying to say Hao Jingfang does the same thing. The action does pick up towards the end, maybe in like the final act. But anyway, what I want to ask with that massive preamble is, do you think there's something equivalent going on here in Vagabonds? Do you think Hao Jingfang is playing with what sci-fi can be, or do you think she's just writing what she wants to write? Although I know that authorial intent, guessing it might not always be the best idea. So maybe rather than what do you think she's doing, what do you feel from the book itself?
Yeah, no, that's a great way to phrase it, because I don't want to get into her intent, because she's spoken extensively about her own approach, and
right.
I don't want to say anything that obviously explicitly contradicts what she's articulated as her rationale. She's said multiple times that she enjoys writing speculatively because it's simpler. When she wants to examine some issue, and one of her core issues is inequality and the definition of inequality and how to resolve it. When you write about inequality in the real world, it's very hard to do so without tacking in all sorts of complexities about history, about ethnic identity, about languages, and so on and so forth, that make the issue hard to see. Because reality is so complex, layered, and nuanced, you can never definitively point to some one thing and say, this is the cause, or this is the effect, and this is the thing I want to examine. In speculative fiction, you can strip away all that complexity and just perform a thought experiment and say, this is the one thing that changed, and it leads to all these consequences. So, as somebody who I now I'm just sort of like speculating. I'm saying that, with an economist, a discipline that's sort of deeply involved in model building and simplifying the real world through models to gain insights. I think she's very in tune with that approach, and she uses her speculative fiction in that way. And you're right. I think you can sort of view Vagabonds as exactly that. It's an attempt to do a thought experiment by simplifying lots of things and focusing on one thing. But it's not your typical sci-fi experiment. It's not about a technology that's invented or something like that. It's about how can we organize societies just in entirely different ways, and what does that mean? So it is. I think the book is challenging for a lot of readers, not just abroad, but also in China. I think many Chinese readers. I can't say many. I mean, many is correct, because there are many people who read her books, period. So any segment will be many. So yeah, a certain number of readers, I think, find Vagabonds frustrating, because it's not what they want in a sci-fi book. They want lots more of the hard sci-fi stuff. They want a lot more of the mathematics about how do you build a flying machine on Mars? How do you what happens to your bodies under the force of reduced gravity? They want a lot more of that stuff. And there's some of it in Vagabonds, but it's not the focus. It's clearly the sort of thing Hao Jingfang threw in here and there. It's not what she's interested in. She's writing something that is marketed as sci-fi, but it does something very different from hard sci-fi for sure. But at the same time, it's not so-called. I mean, hard sci-fi often is implied as being associated with vigor and rigor and so on and so forth. And it's very rigorously done, and this is actually a very rigorously done philosophical work. It's just not rigorous in the way that a lot of hard sci-fi fans want. That's not where the energy is. Not
an engineer's rigor.
It's
like
not
philosophical rigor.
Yes, and so I think that's hard for some readers to wrestle with. So if you go in expecting, like you were saying earlier, a very hard sci-fi novel, or a space opera, or some kind of soft, explicitly political book about how evil the Chinese system is, you're not going to find that here. That's not what this is. This book is much more thoughtful and much more, if I may, I think Hao Jingfang is writing for an imaginary audience 100 years in the future, rather than an audience in the present. And I think that's why this book is the way it is.
Right. So 100 years from now, I'll Skype call you again, and we can see if that's right.
Yes.
Looking forward to it. Okay, next question. So this one's just written down as a paragraph. So I'm just going to read the paragraph, and then at the end of the paragraph, we'll reach the question. So I felt that Hao Jingfang did a pretty good job of showing both the upsides and the downsides of Martian society, as we've kind of already discussed. You've already mentioned slightly that they don't really teach the history of their own society, and I don't really want to spoil the plot. So without spoilers, our heroes, the vagabonds of the title, and a lot of other people in the society are pretty unaware of both the kind of highs and the lows, or the drama and conflict of their society's revolutionary past, or maybe multiple revolutionary pasts, as you've kind of hinted at. And that kind of brought me back to, because our protagonists, the vagabond characters, they're teenagers. So even if this book isn't, I suppose you could read it as a teen fiction or YA book.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it could work on like that favorite book I mentioned earlier by Markus Zusak, I'm the Messenger. It's the same. You could read that as a teenager or an adult, and it's not quite the same book either way around, but it's an equally good book either way around. This one is a very different book, but probably, I think, a similar deal. Anyway, it brought me back to the module I did in my undergrad university days on children's lit. Children's lit studies is a really great. It's great because the academic writing on it is clear and makes sense and is not full of sophistry. It's very to the point, and it makes points that are insightful, easy to understand, not too abstract. One of those points was it was just pointing out that in a lot of children's and young adults literature, the story is kind of like an archaeological dig in a way. It's the child or young person main character learns about the past, but it's their past, the people that came before them. It's often their parents' generation or the generation before that, and all the society that was there before them, before they were born. And that's maybe one reason why those characters' parents are often dead, just like Luo Ying in this story. Her parents are passed away. Just like when I was reading Harry Potter, his parents are gone. And to some extent, or some of the plot is dedicated to finding out about his parents and the people they were at school with. And there's another series I read, A Series of Unfortunate Events, which as it progresses is more and more about what came before these characters were born, before they really knew what was going on. So all that preamble aside, or with all that preamble in mind, my question for you is like the clouding of history in the Martian society, do you think that's the necessity of a plot which is about young people, or do you think it's again, intention, tricky word, maybe does it come across to you as an authoritarian flaw in the Martian society in the book?
So the way I read it is, I think it's a cautionary note about how all societies need to justify who they are by telling themselves a story.
Right.
So, this is very dear and near to my own work. I think Hao Jingfang's work sort of illustrates this point rather than articulates it explicitly, but I'll try to reconcile the two.
A lot of stuff is articulated explicitly, but this one isn't. No one has a speech about how bad it is to cover up history. As far as I remember.
I think the point is rather that every society actually, in order to function, needs a story to explain itself. It needs a foundational mythology, is how I call it. So, America has a founding story, and so does the People's Republic of China, and so does the Republic of China before it, and so does every other.
Those are all revolutionary ones. Those ones.
That's true. I did focus on those for a particular reason. All of these stories have a revolutionary founding event, and they, in order to justify their continued existence, they have to keep on making sense of that origin and to say this is the way things are because this is the way things must be, and it makes sense because here's the story. I think what Hao Jingfang is sort of getting at is all societies, and perhaps in particular revolutionary societies, need to sustain this mythology. And in order to sustain that mythology, you often have to view and tell and teach your history a certain way. Certain revolutions are not palatable. And what ends up happening is when you contain and continue the story for a while, eventually new generations will rebel against it. In the US, you can sort of see this in the way we are now fighting over what is the story of America and who gets to tell it. Hamilton, in some ways, is an example of this recasting and reviewing and interpretation of the founding mythology of America. And so much of our political debates now in the US right now is over who gets to claim to be a core American and who gets to tell the American story, and who gets to now recover aspects of our history that we have not wanted to talk about very much, and what monuments do we want to topple, and what new monuments do we want to raise. And I think Hao Jingfang deals with this in the novel Under Mars. In order for Mars to sustain itself, it has to tell itself a certain story, or at least the older generation and those leaders and folks who are not rebels. Because, I don't want to just make this about generations, because in the book, it's very clear that many in the older generation do not agree with the official story. They see the necessity of some of it, but they don't agree with continuous suppression. The need for achieving equality, for achieving a merit-based society, meritocracy, for achieving freedom, all of these ideals which inspire young people of every generation to become revolutionaries necessitates questioning the foundational mythologies of their birth and their youth. And they have to question the thing that they've been taught, the story that's been passed down, and try to recover the past. And I feel like Hao Jingfang is not explicitly saying this, but I think she's implying that this is, in fact, a necessity of revolutionary societies, that it is inevitable that to sustain a coherent narrative, suppression of history will have to happen. And it is also inevitable that the effort to do this kind of suppression will fail ultimately, and leading to a new wave of revolution.
Yeah, got a wee anecdote of my own here again from a non-revolutionary country. Growing up in Scotland, going through the education system in primary 5, so that would be like 4th grade. Yeah, so that would be American 4th grade. We did the Scottish War of Independence, the one with William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, which the first half you can see in the film Braveheart, or you can see the Hollywood version of it.
Right.
It's not, I mean, there's parts that are really egregious, other parts pretty much follow the real history. But then we go to high school. High school in Scotland starts when you're about, I guess it's the same time as America. The difference is we have no middle school. So yeah, in second year of high school, so that would be aged like 14, 15.
14? Yeah.
Yeah. At which point history is still compulsory. You haven't chosen any of your subjects. Boom! One of the history topics for that year was just the exact same thing again. There's a lot of Scottish history. There are many wars against the English, but the one where we won was the one that came up again, and just literally repeat of what happened in primary school. And then if you take history all the way to the last year of high school, up to age 17 and 18, you actually can do it again. At least in the school I was at, you'd be doing Robert the Bruce again. To be fair, you'd be doing a nuanced angle, but you'd only be getting the most nuanced angle if you did the story for the 3rd time. So I don't know exactly what they do down south of the border in England. Maybe there's more of a focus on imperial stuff, or maybe it's more of World War I and World War II. Maybe that's the modern British foundational quote-unquote myth of modern Britain, the world wars. But just goes to show, I think this stuff, I'm sure whichever country, if I was from any other country, I'm sure there would be, if I was being honest about the education system I'd been through, I'm sure there'd be another example of not necessarily omissions, but omission by focusing on one thing that makes your country look cool or good or defined in a particular way.
It's true. Yeah. And it's not just the level of nations. I mean, foundational mythology is very important to all sorts of subnational identities too. I mean, one of my favorite things as I travel around the US is to go to different state history museums and see how they tell the story of each state. And it's fascinating to see what states try to focus on as they describe their own mythology and explain why they are the way they are, and it's always interesting. I mean, for example, you go to Texas and you see how the history of Texas, its founding as a republic, and its role in the Civil War plays such important roles, and they're so controversial. Now it's being made more complicated, but this kind of effort to tell a coherent story, which requires suppressing certain facts that don't fit with that narrative, it's a worldwide phenomenon. It's human nature, and in some ways maybe it's actually required for any kind of functioning society. You cannot have a functioning society without some agreed upon narrative, even if the narrative necessarily has to be challenged from time to time and changed.
Right. So continuing along this line, here's a carefully worded question. What do you think Vagabonds tells us about domestic Chinese politics and what can or cannot be said under the censorship regime?
Right. So, I'll preface my answer by saying that these kind of questions are very difficult for me to answer, largely because I make such a big point about respecting authorial intent, which also means that I'm not quite free to offer my own interpretations, because when I do offer my own interpretations, there's a huge risk of those who listen attributing these opinions as being informed by authorial intent, and or that I've had permission to make explicit certain things that authors left ambivalent or unclear in their fiction. The way censorship works in China is such that authors and readers have gotten very good at reading between the lines and writing between the lines. And so often what isn't said is just as important as what is said. And authors know how to say certain things to express their frustration or critique or their fundamental doubt about the system without triggering the kind of crackdown that would make things difficult. Over time, of course, the amount of freedom given to authors to even do this sort of thing waxes and wanes. And right now it's in one of those stages where it's shrinking drastically. Right. So if I speak very candidly and openly about speculating about all the ways that I think these are comments on domestic politics, what I'm doing actually is putting the authors themselves at risk without their permission. And I think, as an author, as an author myself, and as a translator, I have to really take very seriously the idea that you cannot do harm to the people you're trying to help. And you are not allowed to take risks with other people's lives. So with all of that said, what I'm going to say is the following.
Thank you very much for that preface, by the way, Ken. Very well said.
Thank you. What I will say is the following. I think the novel can be read, and readers are free to read it as a critique of many aspects of the current system in China. Whether those are intended by the author is obviously not going to be clarified. And if readers wish to read them that way, that is up to the reader. I will also say that if you view this book as solely a book about protests against the current Chinese regime, you're missing out on a lot of what the novel actually has to offer. I think the novel really is aimed to be timeless and it's ambitious. It is not a novel aimed at satirizing or ridiculing just some aspect of the present, a very narrow aspect of the present. It's meant to say something much deeper about human nature and all political entities. Having said all of that, I think one of the ways that's particularly interesting to me, and which readers may not necessarily pick up immediately, is the idea of new generations inheriting revolutionary legacies and their relationship to the ideals of those revolutionary regimes. So Mars started out as a revolutionary, idealistic, utopian society. Mm-hmm. The teenagers of our book, who are third, fourth, fifth generation down from those founding members of the polity, find a complicated relationship to those ideals. When they learn about why the founders of Mars City rebelled against Earth and what they were fighting for, what is their relationship to those ideals? Readers should ask themselves, how do they view their own relationship with those ideals? Later on, there's this entire discussion about how meritocracy, freedom, and equality are all inspiring ideals with abstractions, and they often come into conflict when you're trying to implement them. And so the idea of young people who are yearning for something to throw themselves into, yearning for a revolutionary project to throw themselves into, and how they feel what they do is connected to the founding generation, to me, is a key thing. What I mean is, if you study contemporary Chinese domestic politics, I think one of the most important things that is there, but perhaps isn't talked about as often, is the state has fundamentally given up on its revolutionary roots. In some ways, that's one of the things that's just least appreciated about the contemporary Chinese state. This is a state founded on a radical Marxist ideology.
More radical than the Soviet Union, right?
Yes, of utter abolishment of private property, of complete repudiation of Chinese traditions. It is a Western imported model of Enlightenment-inspired rationalism imposed on a society, leading to many tragedies and massacres and great human tragedy. But people have to remember the founding members, or a large portion of them, and many of the young folks who joined the revolution were idealists. They joined the revolution because they believed they were trying to found a utopia. They were rebelling against colonial domination. They were rebelling against the traditional imperial and corrupt republican regime that they were overthrowing. This is a regime that killed many people.
Refer my listeners back here to the episodes we did on Lucian, 2 episodes on Lucian and 1 on Dingling, both kind of idealists of the mold you're describing. Sorry to interrupt there, but
that's a very good point. And so they were, corresponding to, they could correspond to the Martian founding generation. But today's China has repudiated essentially all those ideals. It's turned into this hyper capitalist state sanctioned capitalism society. So how are the young people supposed to relate themselves to the founding generation? They live in a country that's founded upon revolutionary ideals, none of which is actually even respected as real anymore. This is a country in which folks are pursuing wealth and trying to become influential by pursuing capitalist modes. Equality and meritocracy and freedom, which are the very ideals of the original communist revolution, have been shunted aside. So I think one way to read this is to think about what does it mean to be a young person in China, and who is idealistic and who believes in the ideals of the founding generation and who sees them as being corrupted and ignored and disregarded by modernity, by the current regime. And that means to them. It does not necessarily mean seeking a Western style democracy. I think that's actually something that's very important. For folks who are idealistic, that may not necessarily actually be the model they want to pursue. They may not believe that Western style democracy leads to freedoms and equality and meritocracy. In fact, many of us in the West question whether our current system is even democratic as a result of heavy influence of power groups.
Inherited wealth, private schools.
Right. So think about that. And think about how it could relate to domestic Chinese politics. I think that's a much more fruitful way of thinking about it, and what these young people who are rebelling really represent and what they're saying.
It's a great answer, really, really great answer. You reminded me of one thing I kind of noticed, whether it be reading upon China's revolutionary past and the government as it is now, or talking with the people who I was around when I was living in China, for both within the government and in society, the idea of generations is one of the main lenses through which to view things. The difference in generations is really striking, just like it is in Vagabonds. So that's one thing. Yes. And the other thing is another funny wee anecdote. So I remember, not just in Shanghai, all over China, but I remember a lot in Shanghai, maybe because of the years I was living there, you'd see the Xi Jinping's key words dotted around a lot of posters all over the city, and they're all great high ideals. Wenming civilization is one of them, but the two that maybe for a uninitiated Westerner that seem the strangest are, if I remember right, Minju, democracy, and Ziyou, freedom, which reflects on everything you were saying about high ideals maybe being cast by the wayside. But the funny wee anecdote here, and it'll be extra fun for anyone living in Shanghai because you can try and seek out this location. I remember one day I was exploring the city and I wanted to find one particular cafe because I'd fixated on it. And it was all the way out west, further west than Hongqiao Airport. I don't remember the name of the park. I can maybe try and find it later. But there was a little sign outside the park, which was, it was one of the Xi Jinping or government keywords with a little cute illustration, the Chinese characters, the pinyin, a paragraph of Chinese explaining the concept. So like a very high-minded philosophical thing that you wouldn't see here in the UK. And then an English translation underneath it. And it was Ziyou, it was freedom. It was like a particular definition of freedom, but it was maybe more like a Martian definition. It was the freedom to be relieved of particular burdens to then pursue your life and your career as you want to live it. So like a traditional communist or Marxist definition of freedom, which is a perfectly nice one, but, you know, doesn't require votes or freedom of speech and so on.
Right. It's very interesting to sort of think about this because freedom is such a core concept in the book too. And, you know, Liu sort of debates over different kinds of freedoms. You know, she sort of talks about, are you actually free if you're free to buy whatever you want and to say whatever you want, except no one's listening, and to basically consume as freely as you like without any ability to change the fundamental nature of society, which is, you know, what life on Earth is like. Or are you free in the Martian way, in which many things are constrained and you're assigned to do what you're supposed to do, and you will never have ability to accumulate wealth and to do the things that you can do very easily on Earth. But people claim that they're free because there are certain things they can do. And it sort of makes it very interesting for us to examine our own assumptions about freedom and what it is, you know, we really mean by freedom. I think sometimes that idea is sort of characterized as the difference between freedom from versus freedom to, and the idea is that somehow we, in, you know, the U.S. as an example, we're all about freedom too, and so, you know, where everything we do is right, but I'm not sure, you know, that kind of simplistic dismissal of criticisms of late capitalism should be sustained. I mean, there is an actual way in which people's lives are constrained and our potential limited and our ability to be free absolutely infringed upon when we cannot be, quote unquote, free from the fear of, you know, dying and being without healthcare and being having our livelihoods taken away, the way that many of us sort of live on a daily basis. So it's a very, very difficult and interesting question, and I think it's worth meditating on what the children in the books really mean. In the book, really mean when they say they're pursuing freedom. Is it the Earth version of freedom they're pursuing, or something more closer to what they think of as the kind of freedom that their revolutionary forebears were fighting?
Well, in the British version of freedom, something like more than half of our parliament all have the same undergraduate degree, politics, economics, and philosophy. And the amount of people, you know, they're all the same person in a suit with different hair colors. So if that's freedom, that's nice. Glad to hear it. Yeah, and I remember in not trying to get too distracted here, but I did SQA higher politics, so like the end of Scottish high school, I took the politics module, and we got the stats for the like various statistical breakdowns of the UK Parliament in different eras, and it used to be more working class than it is because of the labour unions being attached to the Labour Party. But maybe just also that society was more equal then. So I don't know how much Vagabonds explores this, but the idea that society might become more fair or more free over time is actively disproved by these stats, because the ratio of working class people in the British Parliament is way down, and the number of people who all have the same undergraduate degree has risen and risen and risen. It's, like we said earlier, it's a crazy world. But before I give you another softball to analyze the book with and go off down all these different alleys, just looking at the time, I think we should march on and look at some translation questions about the story.
Let's finish that up.
Yeah, because I could talk all night about this book, but we can't. That would be crazy. So, first question I've got about translation is from a show. He's actually a former show guest. He was my guest on the Oath to Shin episode we did on the story Devourer. So it's from Adam McMurtry, who's a fellow Dundonian. He's from the same hometown I'm from. And this is a
Nice.
question about process rather than language. So how you go about translation or how you go about your task. So he wants to know like what tools you use. I'm guessing that means software. It could mean physical things, hardware as well. So what tools you use and what methods you go about doing it. And I don't remember which episode it was, but I listened to a podcast you were a guest on where you talked about how you write and the software you use, and it was very interesting. So I'm expecting you've got a cool, maybe cool's a bit too loaded. I'm expecting you have an answer for Adam McMurtry here.
It actually isn't going to be that cool or exciting, but I will attempt to answer it.
Okay.
I've done all sorts of different things. I think the most important part of translation is just to make sure that you can. Okay, I'll talk about process. I think the most important part of translation really is, for me anyway, is to actually read the work over multiple times to actually absorb the author's voice and the author's intention, because it's very hard to figure out what translation voice to use until you've actually absorbed it and figured out the little tricks that the author has put in to do callbacks and echoes and so on and so forth. And once I've done that a few times, I go through a fairly mechanical process of creating a glossary for neologisms that the author has created, and other things like that, so that I can translate them consistently. So, for example, because I know that the book is deeply influenced by Greek philosophy and takes so many images and makes so many references to classical Greek civilization, I had to translate the legislature of the city as bull, the Greek term.
Oh yeah. Now this is a handy thing. When I was reading this on the Kindle, even without Wi-Fi turned on, I could highlight words and it would give me a definition. And I did. Bull was one of the words, but there were other Greek words. So I was like, "What is this? Kindle, save me!" And the Kindle gave me the word, and it would always say, as far as I remember, "This word is from Greek society." Da, 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 da.
Exactly. So I could decide on things like that, which I think are very important, to give the work a consistency, as closely approaching the author's intent as possible. So that's one step. Another step I do is I go through the entire thing and then pull out quotes and references and allusions. And then I have to go look up the original, because, what you don't want to do is to take a quote that's from English translating to Chinese and then back translating to English. Obviously, you want to find the original English in that case. Right. And in cases of translation from other languages, you want to verify them and then try to find the authoritative English translation if it exists, or, do your own translation if it does not. I've actually ended up having to do that because it turns out that, Jingfang, being the erudite person that she is, quotes extensively from British philosophers, from American economists, from French and Russian and German philosophers all the time. So I have to actually get all these quotes down and then look up where the original is and if there exists an authoritative English translation. And of course, there are cases where she invents fictional quotes, and I have to, of course, find those and verify with her that they are in fact fictional. So that step also, you have to go through to pull out all the quotes and allusions and verify with the author whether they are real or they're fictional, and therefore can be retained as is. By the way, this is fascinating. So one of the books that she quotes from or references extensively is Wind, Sand, and Stars by Antoine Saint-Exupéry. And it's a beautiful book, but as it turns out, the French version and the English version are very different. The English version omits certain chapters and includes other material that's very different from the French original. I'm not sure how many people actually know that. It was news to me, but apparently Antoine wanted the English version to be very different, and so he made it that way. But the version that Jingfang quotes from is the French version. So as it turns out, there exists no English translation of it. So I had to end up finding the French original and then do my own translation of it. So that was very amusing, my little debut as a French to English translator.
Yeah. How is your French?
Terrible, but good enough to read French philosophers, which is what I did with my French knowledge.
Right.
So anyway, so it was perfect. I could actually do this part. So that's the other part. You go through the whole thing and then you pull out quotes. And then I think I do one more pass in which the task is actually she also had some Greek quotations, which I could not do myself and had to go consult experts on what to do. Anyway, very interesting stuff. So once I've done all of that, the next step is to start actually doing the translation. And for that step, I just put the documents up side by side, the working draft and the original on the same screen. I tend to do a lot of my work on the iPad or on a Google Chromebook. So I would just try to use software that's effective for presenting the text side by side. And it's not very sophisticated. For translation work, I don't have to do a lot other than the ability to do global search and replace and to be able to easily jump between different sections. So that's what I did.
Right.
And that's pretty much how I approach it. Nothing fancy. Okay,
cool. Another question from another listener of the show. He's an interesting fellow. He's Stefan. Now, my knowledge of Bulgarian names is not great, so I'm going to read this with my English language tongue or brain. Stefan Rusino, and he's working on a Bulgarian translation of Three Body Problem. It's his own initiative, apparently, but he secured the translation rights for it. So this is maybe more of a general question than a Vagabonds question, given the context of you guys both being translators of Santi, Three Body Problem. By Liu Cixin. Stefan wants to know about it's a very open question, just about the bigger changes you make in your translations. And he said the what, the why, and the how.
Right. So it's actually a much harder question to answer than people may think. So I often get asked this question of, how much do you change and what do you change in your translation? And I say, well, I have to clarify with you that the premise of the question may be a little bit flawed if you don't do translations. I mean, in this case, obviously, Stefan knows what he's talking about, but for people who don't, I'll try to clarify. The glib answer to a question like, what do you change and how much do you change when you translate is everything and nothing. Except there's a lot of truth to that glib answer as well. It's everything because, well, you're changing it from one language to the other. So, of course, everything is different. And nothing in the sense that when you say something has been changed from the original, you're implying that the translator has deviated from some ideal, from some perfectly accurate, quote unquote, version of translation. When you deviate from that, you're making a change. But the reality is there is no such thing as that perfectly ideal baseline to deviate from. When you do literary translation, you realize that in fact, every single word and every single sentence and every single paragraph may be translated in countless different ways, all of which are faithful and all of which are unfaithful in varying degrees. There is actually no single way that is, quote unquote, most faithful or perfectly accurate because your role and your approach and your stance towards the text and what you're trying to achieve all alter the approach you're trying to do. So the way I go about making changes, quote unquote, is the following. I try to reconcile between two goals that I'm trying to pursue as a translator. The first goal I'm trying to pursue is fidelity to authorial intention. I know that not all translators do this, but to me, it's a super important ethical part of translation. As an author myself, I have a deep appreciation for how attached authors are to their creations. And because I'm translating friends and I'm trying to help them, I view my primary duty as not to the readers and not to some abstract idea of translation, but to the author herself. And so it's extremely important to me that I understand what the author is trying to do. How explicit does she want to be with each thing that she's trying to do? How convoluted and how much trouble does she want the reader to go through to understand something? And how important is a particular word or idea to her that she wants it to be preserved as much as possible? in favor of other ways of translating that may be more faithful. So for example, there may be a very literal and perfectly simple, straightforward to translate something that would, in a different context, because English readers don't have access to the same information as the Chinese reader, not give, in my view, the same idea as what the author is trying to convey. In that case, I will alter the words by not doing a literal translation and try to convey the idea that she's trying to do. I mean, one of the things that I think listeners of your podcast probably already know, but maybe not necessarily known to everybody else, is that in some ways, a writer in contemporary Chinese has access to a wider range of cultural and symbolic references than a writer working with only mainstream American audiences. What I mean is the following. Mm-hmm. To be an educated modern Chinese reader requires you to be proficient not just with classical Chinese allusions and all the literary conventions and techniques from traditional as well as modern vernacular Chinese literature. You also have to be very conversant with European history, European classical civilization, Greek philosophy, contemporary American pop culture, Japanese and Korean contemporary pop culture, European shows. You actually have to be familiar with all of this stuff. So as a writer, you can count on a readership that is as familiar with Seinfeld jokes as they are with quotations from, records of the grand historian. So you can do that. You can make references, and there are authors like Ma Boyong who does this all the time, who make unexpected comparisons between modern American pop culture and some classical Chinese aspect of thing, and it's incredibly funny, interesting, and all sorts of sophisticated. Just it makes your head explode. Hao Jingfang does something similar. She makes a lot of references to a very wide range of cultural references. The European and Western stuff is easy. Most of her readers in English would be expected to know these, if not all of them. But she also makes some references to classical Chinese stuff that her original readers would know, but her new readers would not. And so, right. I have to make decisions about whether to change these or to explain them or to do whatever else needs to be done to make it work. It's always a tricky thing to do. So as I was saying, one of my primary goals is to respect authorial intent. So I try very hard to do that. The other thing that I try to do is to try to translate as much as possible from a post-colonialist, decolonized stance, and to readers who question whether that sort of thing is important. Well, it actually is. As readers probably, as folks probably remember, it's a big deal when Homer is translated for the first time by a woman translator into English. It's a big deal because depending on the political approach and the sort of stance as an interpreter that the translator brings to the text, lots of things that seem to be unquestionable or to be assumed to be true are changed. This is why translations of the classics change generation from generation. You read a translation of Homer from the 19th century or 18th century or earlier, and it's very different from a modern translation. And it's not because the original changed. It's because the translator's stance and what the translator is trying to do has changed. And so when I try to translate my authors, I try to take a very post-colonialist, decolonized approach. What I mean is there are still translators from a language like Chinese into English who take the stance that, China is a very backwoods country. Chinese authors don't really have anything cosmopolitan or global to say. They belong to a very limited place. They belong to a literary tradition that's very poor compared to the West, and therefore authors writing in Chinese really can't say anything that's great. So I have to go in there and if I want these authors to succeed, I have to go polish them and make them more palatable for Western taste and make them better and improve on them, if you will. That kind of condescension is something that I push very hard against. And I work very hard to not allow that kind attitude to come in. So there are, Western translators who often say, the way Chinese authors write stuff is so rough, it's so non-graceful. I'm going to change it and so that it sounds better. I try to resist those kind of impulses because I think there's a huge amount of beauty in the way modern Chinese has developed new ways of expressing itself, and also just the rich variety of not just cultural references, but also stylistic approaches. Again, like we mentioned earlier, modern standard written Chinese includes a lot of techniques inherited from classical Chinese as well as Baihuawen literature, but also tons of internet slang, a lot of net-based talk, and a lot of translation needs approaches imported from Western languages or from Japanese. And it's very polyphonic and beautiful. And different authors use these techniques to different degrees. And I think some of them, when translated properly, come across as very beautiful. And in fact, if you're a traditional translator, you often take the approach that the most important thing is to not offend your target readers. That is, you must make everything sound as natural as possible so that they feel like the translation was originally written in English. I don't take that approach because I'm a post-colonial, decolonized kind of approach. I have this approach to translation. I think sometimes one of the goals of translation actually is to stretch English a little bit, to allow English to do things it couldn't do before. So if there's a way to do something that feels unnatural, but yet in another sense is super cool and a great way to actually show the novelty and the precision and the beauty of the original, then I'm going to go take it. In the same way that Milton felt perfectly fine to inject Latin grammar and Latin techniques into English, I think it actually respects English and Chinese both more if you're willing to judiciously stretch English and make English do certain things that it does not do normally and does not sound natural. I think that makes things better for both the translation and for the readers who are enjoying the experience. I'm not advocating you do a literal translation. As I mentioned earlier, I think literal translations are often exoticizing the pointless because they obscure the meaning. But I think the pursuit of making translations sound perfectly natural is a fool's errand and possibly deeply condescending.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like art house or arty cinema in a way that part of the value of it is that it's not a completely immersive experience. It often calls attention to the fact you're watching a film. So would you be in favor of a kind of translated Chinese literature which calls attention to the fact that it is translated? Is that kind of attached to what you're saying, or am I misunderstanding?
No, I don't think you're misunderstanding. I think that is certainly one way to understand it, but caveat that with the idea that I'm not advocating that you take the approach of making everything as awkward sounding as possible. That's not what I'm advocating. What I'm saying rather is go read the translation of, say, Homer or Ovid done by modern authors and see how often they say things in a way that is not what you would expect of a translation from classical Greek. We have a certain idea in our heads of how these translations from classical Greek and Latin ought to sound. And modern translations, when they're good and when they're beautiful, when they're done by translator poets, rarely sound like that. But at the same time, they don't sound like some 20-year-old young writer born and bred in America has composed a new work in perfectly innocuous American English. There are things about these translations that make it clear that they are in fact translations. Okay. Right. So what I'm advocating is that is what I'm doing. It shouldn't sound like your traditional stereotyped translation from the Far East from the 19th century. That is not what I want at all. No. At the same time, I don't want you to make everything sound like they were written by an author who is just your typical quote unquote American author writing a novel that happens to be set in China. I think both approaches are bad. You need to take an approach that combines or rejects both extremes and tries to give you something that actually stretches English a little bit and makes it clear to the reader that this is a translation, but it's natural, it's beautiful, because it gives you a little echo of what it was like in the original Greek or Chinese. And I think that is the ideal to strive for.
Well said. For anyone, again, who's listening, you come to the show because Ken is here and you're interested in what he's been talking about. I've done 2 episodes on interesting modern or newer translations of Chinese literature. One, I forget. Yes, I think the one which came first it was yet again, I'm bringing up Lu Shun. It was on Matt Turner's new translation of Ye Cao Weeds by Lu Shun, which he's called. Oh no, sorry. The first translation, which was done by Yang Xianyi and is it Grace Yang, I think. They were working for a publication house in China in the People's Republic. Their version was called Wild Grass. Editor's note, she was called Gladys Yang, not Grace Yang. And even just the title is interesting. Matt Turner called it Weeds, and even both titles apply. And if you look at the 2 versions, they're very different. So that's one episode that illustrates kind of what Ken's saying. And another episode I did is on an even more peculiar or intriguing thing. It's a Scots translation of Water Margin, Shui Hu Zhuan, by a guy called Brian Holton, who I'm hoping to have as a future guest on the show. And that's a rendering that seems to really capture the spirit of the original classical Chinese, but the version of English it's in is very different from any other translation you'll find. So 2 little
That's
episodes
awesome.
that, it's pretty cool. And it's that, as I talk about on that episode, that's up on a Scottish language corpus. It's like the first 11,000 words, I think. It's a big chunk. The opening section of Water Margin is up there in Scots. Even for me, it's challenging to read, though, because it's properly Old Scots, which is maybe appropriate, because the thing is from, or maybe it's not from classical Chinese. But anyway, it's an old text. Anyway, I've rambled far too much, so let's get on to the next set of questions. These are about further reading, so I've got a little thing written here. I'll rattle it off. Rather than looking at the different other selves, the different language versions of Vagabonds, let's look at its connections to other works. Because it's, like you've said, this book is full of references and quotes, and I've written that it's trying to be part of at least one literary tradition. Maybe that's a bit of a bold claim, but it's certainly harkening back to lots of different things from all over the world. So this time, I'm going to play maybe a little bit of a game or take a different approach. I won't ask you a question. I'll just name the text, and then I'll ask you to riff on it. Are you up for that?
We can, although I think some of these we have already riffed on, but go for it.
Yeah,
let's see how far we get.
I'm going to skip. I'm going to skip Wind, Sand, and Stars because I think we've covered that one. The others, I think we could talk about a bit. So the first one is the Dispossessed, an Ambiguous Utopia by Ursula K. Le Guin, and maybe some of her other works too. How do you think that relates to Vagabonds?
Well, The Dispossessed actually was the book that I used to explain Vagabonds to publishers and readers initially, because I think it's the most well-known sort of Western analog to what Jingfang's trying to do. The Dispossessed is, it posits 2 planets, two worlds.
Yes, it's not Earth and Mars, is it? I think I might have said earlier in the show it was. Misremembered that.
It's not Earth and Mars. It's two planets. Well, not planet. One of them is the moon, and the other. But it's sort of a double planet situation in which one of them is a much smaller society founded by rebels and exiles from the other. And of course, the larger world is very hyper capitalist and very, in some ways, just a caricature. In some ways, I say, a caricature of the world that we're familiar with. And the other is an anarchist, collectivist, revolutionary society. And sort of the story is about a person traveling from one to the other and sort of learning more about both and the deep ambivalence and ambiguity of both worlds. And I think, it in a lot of ways captures the same kind of feeling that Vagabonds gave me as I was reading it.
Yeah. Amen to everything you just said. Let's speed on. So here's an author who actually came up in the episode with Shadja. It's not an author she'd referenced, but it's an author who has a very quotable line about an eternal summer. Eternal summer. It's Albert Camus, and his work, The Rebel, or as it's referenced by its French title in Vagabonds. Sorry tell me if I'm saying the French wrong, because I did German in school, not French. L'homme révolte.
Close enough. Yeah,
Close
close
enough.
enough.
Right.
Not that I would do a lot better. My French
Right.
teacher always got so upset when I tried to read aloud that she was just like, okay, stop.
Oh well, at least she's honest.
She's honest, yeah. So that the Rebel is very much a philosophical essay about revolutions and why and what it is the rebels really do, and it's poetic. It's very beautiful. So much of Camus' writing is. It flows. Just every line is quotable. It's like one of those movies in which every shot is like some frameable picture. Every line is like quotable. It's beautiful.
Absolutely.
And it shows up again and again in this book. I mean, in some here I'll explain something, and I think this will tell people whether they will like this book or not. If you're the kind of reader who hears that the main character of this novel reads The Rebel and is inspired by it and then comes back to it at crucial moments to quote from it time and again, and you find this incredibly moving and beautiful, then this is the novel for you. If you're the kind of reader who hears that and says, oh, that sounds ludicrous and so not my thing and so over the top, then this is not the book for you. That's actually a very good way to judge.
Yeah, well said. That's a book. That's one of the two books by Camus I read. The other one's The Stranger, and I read that living in China, and it felt a little bit like it felt reading Vagabond, where it was like, oh gosh, this is very poetic, philosophical. Is this crossing any particular line? Could I apply this to modern China? Maybe, maybe not. It's more just stands as a piece of literature, as a really thoughtful piece of literature. And like it also is this a raise your fist leftist book? Kind of not. It kind of just is.
Yeah.
But also it just its own thing. Like he's a cool dude. I think he knew he was a cool dude. Next one. This is a book, a non-fiction book by Hao Jingfang called, well, a translation of its name into English would be Time in Europe. The Chinese, if I've got this right, is Shuguang Li De Ouzhou.
Yep, that's right.
So what's that one about?
I believe that is a collection of memoir essays that Jingfang wrote about her travels in Europe, essentially, her reflections on Europe, and of course related to identity as a Chinese person. I think it's very natural to read this book and then sort of see that some of Luo ruminations on her time on Earth must be inspired in some way by her own experience, and I think that's perfectly fine if you want to read it that way. But I think it's don't let that become sort of the determination for how you want to approach the book. It certainly is one way that I think Jingfang gets at the emotional truth of what it means to be a vagabond person. Because one of the things about Vagabonds is it's a book about homeland and what it means to have homeland. And I'm going to read from you. This is actually a quote from Wind, Sand, and Stars, but it appears in Jingfang's book as a core passage. If the desert appears at first only as emptiness and silence, that is because it doesn't offer itself to inconstant lovers. A simple village in our homeland would hide itself from us in the same manner. If we do not renounce the rest of the world for its sake, if we do not enter its traditions, its customs, its rivalries, we cannot understand why it is someone's homeland. I think it's such an important passage because it really encapsulates so much about what it means to be patriotic, to have a homeland, and to identify with it. This is not the blood and folk and earth and dirt and we got to kill the invaders version of nationalism, patriotism that gets slung around so much. This is something much simpler and much more basic. It's that a people and the land that they inhabit become a co-told story. In the same way that the landscape shapes the people shape the landscape. And it is very hard sometimes for visitors to understand why a landscape that otherwise appears as full of poverty or bleakness or some sort of thing that we don't identify as beautiful can be loved by the people who live there. But it's very simple. when you have a homeland, you renounce the world for its sake, and you enter its traditions, its customs, its rivalries, and you become part of its story. And Jingfang's novel is very much about Luo Ying's experience of first having a homeland and then losing it and then rediscovering it again. And it's one of the most beautiful stories about what it means to love a people and a land that I've ever read. And it's not about so much of the way modern nationalisms and modern chauvinism is manifested is this idea of hating someone else in order to show that you love your homeland. And this is not about that at all. And that's what makes it so beautiful. Luo Ying does not hate Earth when she loves Mars again. She loves Mars precisely because she also loves Earth. But she has to renounce it for a certain homeland. And that homeland may not be Mars. It may be something very different. And that's what makes the whole thing so beautiful. It's about finding a homeland. And the homeland may in fact not be a traditional homeland. It may be something entirely different. For each of us to discover.
Well, since you've mentioned deserts and questions of homeland, I kind of have to take this opportunity for anyone new to the show to just plug the previous episode we did, which was about the writer San Mao, who was born in China, grew up in Taiwan, and is most famous for writing kind of like travel diaries from the Western Sahara, which was a Spanish colony at the time, adding another kind of level of questioning about the land and the people and the author's own homeland. I don't want to get lost down that tunnel, but again, just addressing the listeners, that's a fantastic episode with another awesome translator, Mike Fu. So I highly encourage all of you to check it out.
Yeah, some of those books are very beautiful too. So if you haven't read them, they're very cool.
Absolutely. Let's go on to the next little name drop. Now, I could be completely wrong about this one, but I'm fairly certain this was a direct, not, I suppose, an indirect reference in the book, and it's Hamlet by some guy who I had to read a lot in school. I think he was called William.
Yeah, some guy who shakes a spear around or something like that.
Him.
Him. Yeah. No, that's definitely the case. A lot of classical literature, but especially Hamlet, that gets referenced. The hesitation, the whole idea of existentialism. Hamlet is, existential hero, if you will.
And Luo Ying is, I guess, the main Hamlet character. There's literally some points where she's like, I can't decide. I'm just not sure. I don't. And she's like, should I act? Should I not act? And that's Hamlet.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think we shouldn't spoil what the really specific reference in the plot is. But if you know Hamlet, I think you guys will like it. It's a good one, and it doesn't feel shoehorned in. It fits the story, I think.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. And the last name drop is one I've not prepared anything. I'm wondering if you'd like to point readers to any text that is related to or referenced by Vagabonds.
I think not directly. I do think that it's you'll get more out of the book if you know something about Neo-Platonist philosophy and the whole notion of the one and so on, because that comes up quite a bit in the book. She's very she really goes very deep into it. And I think if you understand something about the Neoplatonist idea of beauty, of the one, of its manifestation in this world of forms, you will have a different kind of appreciation for the book. I think you will appreciate more. And of course, if you have read either the English or the French version of When Sent in the Stars, I think you'll get a lot more out of this book as well. It's just a very, very important foundational text for a lot of what Luo Ying has to say.
Fantastic. Great answer. Great recommendation. Now, we're getting near the end, and at this point, I've got some more kind of fan questions for you. So, questions listeners and fans of the show have passed on to, or given to me to pass on to you. Now, the first one, we might skip over this one, to be honest, because as you've stressed, you are not the mastermind. You don't know everything. But one person is asking what's happening with the film of the three-body problem and the Amazon TV series adaptation. Is this a question that is right to direct at you, or is this asking the wrong person?
I can't say much because, what I know, I can't say, and I don't know much. So okay. I can't really say anything.
Okay, right. Next question. This is a very specific question to the three body problem. It's about the wall face, and anyone who's not read three body or doesn't have it memorized off by heart, skip ahead about 30 seconds. And again, I don't know how much you'd have to say about this, but let's satisfy this listener. For the wall facer Frederick Tyler, which version of his plan is your favorite? To turn the swarm fighters into quantum mirages, or to use supermassive hydrogen bombs to attack the Trisolaran fleet with ice as bait? Is this something you have an opinion about?
I don't have an opinion. I can say something about it, which is this wrote the new plan for the English edition, and obviously the author did it for a reason. I think we as readers are free to prefer one version over the other, but do know that the author did create the new version, and that is what the author wanted to do for the English edition. I personally like the original plan better, just because it echoes what happens in Vault Lightning, and it makes a nice connection to the larger set of all his novels. But it's not like I think the new version is somehow not good.
Cool. Thanks. So for me, I have read Three Body and I've heard about this. So the first option there, that's in the Chinese version, and the second is in the English. Is that right?
That's right. Although I have to also add the other point, which is many of the editorial changes that were made for the English publication of the Three Body series were then later on backported, to use a software term, to the Chinese edition. So I don't know if this particular plan was. My understanding is that it was not. So this is a change that's only for the English edition.
Okay. And the same guy, I'm letting him get two questions through. He's assuming you know about these. So he's asking, what do you think of the Minecraft three body animations? But that kind of implies the question, have you heard about them?
Yeah, I've seen them. They're cool, and they show how much fans love the work, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I've not watched them yet. I should get around to it. It at least looks fascinating. Okay, we have a question from a lady here. She's asking, I guess she hasn't specified the books, so take this as you will, which book she's talking about. What preparations did Ken have to do before translating the books? I guess she probably means Three Body. And
yeah.
The next question's for me. Could you post a link to your podcast? Yes, I will. But yeah.
Yes. I think I answered this earlier already. I mean, I said that I think, I don't know how many translators talk about this, but going through the whole thing multiple times in order to figure out a consistent glossary, and if you're working with co-translators, working with them to settle on a glossary is important. And I think going through the whole thing to pull out quotes and references so you can look up the original and then do new translations, or find someone who can fix your translation. In my case, I ended up actually approaching my French editor to help make sure that my translation is good. That's also a step that's important. And other than that, I don't know how much preparation needs to be done. I mean, you can do all the preparation you want, and you're still going to screw up. I made mistakes just because there were slang terms that I didn't know and I mistranslated, and then if I'm lucky, the author or the beta reader would help me catch it and tell me, hey, screwed up. And if I'm not lucky, it comes out, and then it becomes a little embarrassing incident where some reader writes to me and says, you screwed up, and then I go fix it. So you do the best you can, and you're still going to screw up. And if it happens, it happens. You learn from it, and you move on.
Such is life. Amen. Next question. This is from, it's a Mr. Zhu. I think this is a question from a guy who's in the PRC and using a VPN to reach out to me. He's asking, what do you think about Cheng Xin, the main character in Three Body 3? And a second question, again, how much you can answer this, I don't know, but is she widely discussed by English language readers?
Well, I have to say that I don't particularly pay attention to what people say about books. I don't pay attention to what people say about even my books, much less one of the books I translated, because I feel like, my job is to help the author and to craft the best version of the English rendition of her work that I can. And beyond that, how it gets received is entirely outside of my control and the author's control. And so worrying about it is pointless. But
So I don't know what most readers say about Chenxing. I will say that I found her to be a really well done character, and that the novel makes a big point about her. Oh, I will say that I did get into one discussion where somebody apparently misread the book entirely and said that Chenxing is supposed to represent liberal Western values, and the book makes it seem like liberal Western values always lead to terrible mistakes. And I have to say, whoever thought that must have been a terrible reader and have no reading comprehension. That's not what Three Body says about that at all. If anything, Three Body goes out of its way to say that Chenxing made the right decision, because over and over again, we're told this is not her decision. We have to actually understand that the people chose her. And so the people made this decision. And it is the right decision. The book goes out its way to point this out, which is that sometimes survival is not the only thing that matters. And you have to understand that a value is worthwhile, not because it leads to victory, but because it is the right thing to do. Again and again, Chenxing makes these decisions that are motivated by modern liberal values, and they lead to disasters. That is not the reason to say somehow renounce these values. The point is, values are only worthwhile, and you only show your dedication to these values if you're able to hold on to them in spite of the fact that they don't always lead to victory. That's the important thing. The universe isn't quote unquote fair just because you are a democracy and you are dedicated to freedom doesn't mean you're always going to win every war. Surely people understand that, right? That you're dedicated to freedom and democracy and living a life of equality and pursuing those values, not because you're going to win against your enemies every time. If that's what you want, maybe this isn't for you. Maybe liberal values aren't for you. The reason why you adopt these values is because they are the right thing to do. And sometimes you lose, even if you're trying to do the right thing. Surely we all know that good does not always triumph. And so that's kind of the point Three Bodies making. It's that these are the right things to do. And, sometimes you don't win. You don't win even if you do the right thing. And for folks who criticize Chenxing as somehow bad, then I think these are the people who think survival is the only value. And I hope that they're not the people in charge.
Right. Well said. Yeah, you were giving me flashbacks to just reading the last of the Three Body trilogy book, Death's End. If you really want some to be provoked to thinking, like, what is winning, what is surviving, that's an amazing, that book blows your mind multiple times.
That's
looking at those kinds of things.
Right. I think readers who criticize her have just not understood the book, or they have completely missed the point.
Okay, I think you're probably right. Last question here in this thread, and this is a completely different breed of question. It's from Lance King Bluff, and I think he's referring to something called trisomy. I think that's probably referring to Three Body Problem. So, assuming,
I think so. Sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure what translation that is, but I will respect it, and I'll assume it means Three Body. So if you could write the ending of Three Body, what would you write? Would you wrote it the same way that Liu Cixin wrote it, or would you go for another ending? And have you ever thought about writing a sequel to Three Body? And we can maybe inform Lance if he doesn't know about Redemption of Time here as well.
Yeah, I feel like if you want a cool sequel or paraquel to the Three Body universe, Bao Shu's Redemption Time is the thing to go for. I mean, it's incredible. No, I'm not interested in. I've never been interested in working in someone else's book because it's just not my thing. The only media universe I ever participated in is Star Wars, and that's because I grew up as a Star Wars fan, and I just couldn't turn down the idea of writing for Star Wars. But other than that, I can't think of any other universe that I want to work in except the ones that I create myself.
Mm-hmm. I did talk about the ending of Three Body as a whole on the episode with Shaja. Again, without spoiling what it is, the main thrust of it is as an adult, movies have started to make me cry. as an adult, books don't get me, but there are exceptions. And there's something that happens at the end of Three Body, which you'd think out of all the book series you'd read, might, being such hard sci-fi, wouldn't be a tearjerker. And definitely, like, the thing that happens at the end, it's something that touched me on, like it was an idea or a concept, not like a melodramatic scene, but I was like, damn, and it hit me, and it got the old waterworks going. So if I was a writer, would I change that? No, because I don't think I could do it better than Liu Cixin did it. It's a really interesting, powerful, mind-bending ending.
Yeah,
but yeah. I think that final image is wonderful. And of course, once you read the Redemption of Time, you have another layer of interpretation, possible interpretation thrown in. So it's just really cool to see the two writers conversing with one another in their works that way.
That one is in my to-read list. Plugging in yet another past episode, in that sci-fi series I did, the last entry was Bao Shu's another time-based story. Why have I forgotten what it's... Oh, What Has Passed Shall in Kinder Light Appear. If you guys have read Redemption of Time and you read that story, or you're interested in Bao Shu, or just playing with time in sci-fi, just read the story and listen to the episode, because you won't be disappointed.
Right. I should mention that, there's a tangential connection to Vagabonds, which is a very philosophical novel. Bao Shu actually majored in philosophy and is a philosopher.
Right.
And so his books tend to meditate around the concept of time in various ways. And so if you like philosophical fiction, Bao Shu is also interesting, but not philosophical in the same way Vagabonds is. Vagabonds is very philosophical and explicit.
It's
characters
like
talk to each other about
sociological, right?
Right. Whereas Bao Shu often is philosophical in the sense that he takes a philosophical idea and turns it into an interesting premise, and then just runs a whole thought experiment on that premise. And it's fascinating, beautiful stuff.
And I think I just interrupted you saying, I apologize, that more of the philosophy is more in the characters' dialogue in Vagabonds. Is that what I interrupted?
I think Vagabonds is very explicit. You literally have these people going at each other making philosophy speeches. It's all interesting to me, but I know that some readers really dislike that. But like you were saying earlier, I think Vagabonds comes in a tradition in which that sort of thing is a common technique.
Greek philosophy.
Right, if you're familiar with something called Sophie's World, which I believe is, I think it's a beautiful book, and it is explicitly quoted in Vagabonds, and it is actually a very good analog to the style of Vagabonds. It's a very explicitly philosophical novel, if you will.
Yes, I think when we were talking, I know I've honestly forgotten where. I'm not going to pretend I remember, but I almost brought it up earlier in the episode as like. I know what it was. So Sophie's World I read at the end of high school when I was starting to read philosophical stuff. And it's a great intro to philosophy because, I think the author actually wrote it. Jostein Gaarder wrote it, I think, as something he would read to a family member to introduce them to Western philosophy. And that's what the book does.
I believe it's right. Yeah,
in an interesting way.
That's right.
Yeah, there are other books I read at that period which did similar things. I think one of them was Breakfast with Socrates, which is like one of these pop philosophy books that takes your daily routine and analyzes each segment by a different philosopher's ideas. But yeah, like if you're starting to get interested in political philosophy, weirdly enough, Vagabonds is a great book for you, I think.
I think so too. I think it does a lot of interesting things, and I really, I really do think you if you approach it as, a book that has a lot to say about political theory and political philosophy in general, and how the world is, it's sort of between the way it is and the way it ought to be and the way it could be. If you approach it that way, I think there's a lot the book can offer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I don't think I can pull any more questions out of the air, apart from just to say, is there anything that we've not touched on but really should have that you'd like to mention now?
No, that's pretty much it. I mean, I do want to remind readers that, when Jingfang's talking about creativity and the importance of creativity, it's a subject that she's personally very passionate about. So when her Martians are passionate about it, this comes from something that's very deep in all the other work that she's done. I can't emphasize enough how much she's put herself into creating viable, creative education for children in rural parts of China who just don't have access to this sort of thing at all. And it's really important to realize that this is not about, pushing education in the sense of let's push some books and things for kids to memorize so they can take tests. That's not what this is about. She's pushing for giving kids the tools to create their own worlds, to trust their own ability to be creators. And that's something that isn't just relevant for China. My gosh, it's so relevant for the world as a whole, for all of us. And I feel like, sometimes our public schools don't have the room or the ability to emphasize this enough. But creativity truly is one of the most, if not the most important thing education ought to foster. And we just don't do it.
Yeah, during my education, that's come a few times in the show, is in a state school, and there was a lot of emphasis on creativity, but that was before the era of like post 2008 austerity, budget cuts hit us, or just as I was coming to the end of school, that was just beginning to bite. And of course, the first things that get slashed are all these soft, quote unquote, soft creative things. And that was me. Although it was a state school, it was a suburban area. It was mostly quite well off kids attending. And I can only imagine how much of a gulf separates me and, well, people all over the world, but especially the kids, the kind of children and communities that Hao Jingfang's organization is trying to reach out to. So it's a great thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One last question, and it's about you. Is there any of your own work or your own platforms or outlets that you'd like to plug and direct our listeners towards?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's the day we're doing the recording today, February 25th, happens to be the publication date for my second collection of short stories, The Hidden Girl and Other Stories. It's out from Head of Zeus in the UK and Simon Schuster in the US. So if you're curious about my own work, that's a good place to start.
That's really cool. I read your other collection, The Paper Menagerie, and maybe some of our other listeners have. Is The Hidden Girl more of, well, it's not the most positive phrase, but is it more of the same, or is it offering something a bit different?
No, I totally get what you mean.
Yeah.
It's it's more of the same in the sense that they're all my stories.
Yeah.
So there will be thematic similarities. It's different in that The Paper Menagerie was very much a book about, it collected basically my stories that have been well received by some objective quote unquote measure, meaning it won some award, it was nominated for some award, critics said nice things about it, etc. And that, as you know, based on my philosophy for doing anthologies, that happens to be not my preferred way to do collections at all. Right. I often don't agree with what other people treat as awesome. I have my own ideas about what is particularly interesting about my own work in the same way that I think about other people's work. So right. The Hidden Girl and Other Stories is different in that this time the stories are picked by me, and I just picked the stories that I thought were interesting or showed delved into themes that I found to be particularly relevant. And so I expect this book will appeal to a different audience in the sense that some people who in that the stories in this collection are more me, in the sense that they're more personal, and they often are done in a style that's more experimental, and they often eschew sort of ideas about storytelling that many people accept, but I don't accept. And so right. It's quirky. It's going to be more weird, I guess, is the best way I can put it. But if right. you happen to resonate with my voice and the way that I do things, you're going to probably like this more than you like The Paper Menagerie.
So could we say Paper Menagerie is like the Earth book, and this Hidden Girl, that's going to be like the Martian book?
Wow, I like that.
You can have that for free.
That is a nice way. I like your approach. Sure, we can go with that.
Cool. On that note, I think I should just say thank you so much for coming on the show, and for so long. This is going to be our longest episode by a long way, and I'm sure the listeners will love it. So thank you for me, and I think on their behalf, thank you as well, I guess.
Oh, thank you, Angus.
Right, so thank you again to Ken Leo for that fantastic chat. I'm honestly over the moon to have had him on the show. That was something I had like shower thoughts and daydreams about when I did the first tentative episode about Lucian's Diary of a Madman. By the way, how many times did I mention Lucian in this chat with Ken Leo? You could probably do a drinking game if you wished. Podcast drinking games. Probably not the best variety of drinking game, but it would work in this instance, I think. So anyway, a reminder for all you guys that Vagabonds is coming out in English in April, the 14th of April, and Ken Leo's The Hidden Girl, his new collection of stories, which as with the conclusion we reached, Paper Menagerie is the short stories that succeeded best according to like the law of the majority and market conditions, and The Hidden Girl is stuff that's a little bit more particular, a little bit more personal, a little bit more artistic. That is now out. Ken Leo is probably working to promote it right now, and do him a favour, go buy a copy. I'm sure you won't be disappointed. Yeah, so that's enough promo for him. Let's do some promo for me and myself and this podcast. So if you'd like to get in touch with the show, there are now lots of places you can do it. There's a Facebook discussion group and page. They're a little bit lifeless right now. I'm kind of waiting to see if they grow at all. But the best places you can go online, I would say, are Instagram and Twitter. My Twitter is mostly stuff about the podcast, the occasional more general thought. It's at Angus Likes Words. That's a great place to help, well, retweet the show, get it out there, but also to have little quick exchanges with me, or there's the DMs if you want a proper talk. Instagram is a really good place too. The podcast has its own Instagram account. It's at Trchfic, TRCHFIC. I post news about the show, I post pictures of books and things related to upcoming episodes. For example, DCA, which is Dundee's Art House Cinema, has a little like art gallery exhibition space, I suppose, and it just so happened that in the run-up to this episode they had an exhibition on the left hand, on Ursula K. Le Guin and the Left Hand of Darkness, and it just so happened in there they had lots of different versions in translation of the book covers, and there was a Japanese, Korean and Chinese, as well as other European language editions, and my little photo of the Chinese edition is up on the Instagram. So that's not an example of exciting news about the podcast, that's an example of one of the cool wee things I put up there. But yeah, Instagram has cool wee things, it has cool news, and maybe best of all, it has group chats. I've been taking advantage of Instagram's group chat feature to make a Sanmao group chat and like a Chinese science fiction group chat. They've each got a few members, a few people who've had like a nice wee talk. I'm pretty much going to make a new one for every single episode that's upcoming, and I'll put a little thing in the Instagram stories with a button you can click to join. Those stories run out in one day, but you can still be invited to the chat by anyone who's in them, myself included. So if you'd like to be in a Sanmao group chat or a Chinese sci-fi group chat, follow the podcast's account on Instagram and ask, and I'll put you in the group, and you can say hi to all the enthusiasts who are in there already. It would be nice to see those being an ongoing thing, and of course accumulating as I make more and more of these group chats. Just a nice wee thing, and not behind a paywall. Speaking of things behind paywalls, if you'd like to support the show materially, financially, help me survive harsh market conditions, although we're not really in the market, but if you want to help me pay the hosting fees and give me a little something back for what I put in, there's two places you can do it. There's Patreon, which has several hours of bonus content you can listen to. I do always intend to make more, time is always against me, so I haven't added anything up there recently, but the intention is always to add things. But there are hours of bonus shows and my thoughts and ramblings, which are up there that you can access by giving. Even just $1 a month gets you access to all of it, but there are other more generous options if you are a generous person. If you would rather give like a one-off contribution to the show, there's Buy Me a Coffee, which it's exactly what it sounds like. You leave a little message and a one-off contribution rather than a monthly one. That doesn't unlock bonus content, but it does force me out of politeness and the natural human emotion of gratitude to leave you a reply. So both those places have very easy URLs. One is patreon.com/Trchfic, which is TRCHFIC. Buy Me a Coffee is exactly the same. Buymeacoffee.com/Trchfic, CHFIC. But here's something that is even better for the show than social media. It's telling people face to face, or it doesn't have to be face to face, but word of mouth. Spreading the word is the best thing you can do for the show, in my humble opinion. So please do. Tell your console, tell your comrades, tell the plucky band of teenagers that you went to an alien society with. Tell your friends and family as well, that could be important too. But all in all, thanks for listening. Really hope you enjoyed this episode. I'm sure you did. And until next time, 再见.